There is a phrase spoken by Jesus that no priest reads aloud on Sunday. It's in Matthew chapter 11 verse 11. It's in Luke chapter 7 verse 28. The oldest manuscripts we have record it. Translators have never managed to disguise it, although they have tried 1,000 ways to soften it with commas, with adjectives, with apologetic footnotes, but it remains there, intact, brutal, indigestible, for 2,000 years. The phrase is this: among those born of women there has not risen anyone greater than John the Baptist. Stop there, read it again, don't skim over it. Who is saying this phrase is Jesus, Jesus himself. It's not an enthusiastic disciple, it's not a crowd exaggerating, it's not a careless scribe. It's the central character of the New Testament affirming in two independent gospel witnesses that among all the men who have ever been born of a woman in this world, all the patriarchs, all the prophets, all the kings, all the wise men, Abraham, Moses, David, Isaiah, Elijah, there is no one greater than John. Think about the weight of this statement. There is no one greater than John. Not Moses, who received the law, not Elijah, who ascended to heaven in a chariot of fire, not David, the anointed one, not Abraham, the father of faith. No one greater than John. And then, after pouring this mountain over the reader's head, the text continues. It continues in a strange way. It says, "But the least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he." Wait, what does that mean? We just read that he is the greatest. Now we are reading that the least is greater than he, in two consecutive sentences, in the same paragraph, from the same mouth. For 1,600 years, Christian theologians have been trying to explain this contradiction. They invented allegorical interpretations, distinctions between dispensations, theological schemes with layers of celestial hierarchy to try to make these two sentences fit together without hurting each other. But any honest reader who sits at the table with that text and reads it without the filter of 14 centuries of commentary immediately realizes these two pieces were not written by the same hand. The first part is ancient. It is prior. It has the rough taste of primitive traditions, those that were passed mouth to mouth, of things that were actually said. It sounds like a historical statement. It sounds like Jesus. The second part is a stitch, it's a patch, it's an addition from a later generation, from someone who read the first sentence, felt its danger, and decided, before the parchment was copied again, to graft in a theological balance that would return Jesus to the throne. This stitch is the crime. And it was one man, in a silent attic in the city of Amsterdam in the 17th century, who had the courage to point to this stitch with his finger and say aloud what no one was authorized to say. His name was Baruch Spinoza. You need to understand who he was before continuing. You need to feel the weight of the ground he walked on. Spinoza was the son of Jewish merchants who had fled Portugal carrying the smell of inquisitorial bonfires in their lungs. His grandparents had seen other grandparents burned in public squares. Cousins had disappeared in dungeons. Aunts had been forced to confess to crimes they did not commit so that their bones could be left in peace. The whole family arrived in Amsterdam with what every persecuted family carries: the certainty that faith is serious business, that thinking is dangerous, and that the community that welcomes you is the only thing standing between you and definitive exile. And it was precisely that community, the community that had saved his parents, that expelled him from the midst of the living when he was 23 years old. The scene needs to be imagined to be felt. It's morning. It's July 27th, 1656. The Portuguese synagogue of Amsterdam is full. Grey-bearded men sitting in the front pews, black candles lit around the Holy Ark. The chief rabbi, Saul Levi Mortera, ascends to the pulpit. He has a scroll in his hands. He begins to read. His voice fills the synagogue. He reads the herem, the decree of excommunication. And the decree that Mortera reads that morning, over the head of a 23-year-old boy, is the most brutal herem ever recorded in the rabbinical archives of Holland. He invokes all the curses of Deuteronomy. He asks that the Lord curse Baruch Spinoza when he lies down and when he rises, that he be cursed when he leaves home and when he enters, that his name be blotted out from under heaven, that no one from the community speak to him, that no one write to him, that no one read what he writes, that no one stay within 4 cubits of him, and as each curse is pronounced, one of the black candles is extinguished, one by one, until the entire synagogue is plunged into darkness. Baruch Spinoza left that synagogue alive, but socially and religiously dead. Exiting through the side door, descending the stone steps of the canal, he was attacked by a fanatic from his own community who tried to stab him in the back. The dagger tore his coat. The skin did not yield. Spinoza kept that torn coat for the rest of his life, hanging on the hook in his room, and it is said that he looked at it every morning before sitting down at the table to write, as one who remembers every day what the price of thinking without permission is. And it was sitting at that table, in modest rented rooms in Rheinsberg, in Voorburg, in The Hague, with the window open to the canals and the damp smell of Holland coming in with the breeze, that Baruch Spinoza did what 1,600 years of Christian readers had not managed to do. He read the Gospels as he would read any other document, not as scripture, not as the Word of God, not with that reverential tremor inherited from centuries of catechesis and fear. He read as he would read Thucydides writing about the Peloponnesian War, as he would read Tacitus writing about the Roman emperors, as he would read an old letter found in a forgotten chest, written by human hands in human moments for human purposes. And it was in that kneeling free reading that he saw what no one was authorized to see. He saw the phrase in Matthew 11:11, the phrase in Luke 7:28, the brutal and indigestible phrase, "Among those born of women, there has not risen anyone greater than John the Baptist." And he saw, alongside it, the stitch. A philologist trained in Hebrew, Latin, and Greek, Spinoza perceived what 1,000 devout readers did not perceive, that the stitch had a different style, a different syntax, a different theological weight, that the first part of the phrase was prior, that the second part had been added later by concerned hands, that between the mouth of Jesus who said the first part and the pen of the editor who added the second, something had changed in the Christian world, something that made that first phrase, left alone, become unbearable. And Spinoza, lens cutter, began to polish that crystal. Polishing a crystal requires absurd patience. You spend all day with that block of glass in your hands, scraping with emery powder, smoothing, and for hours and hours nothing happens. The crystal remains opaque, but at some point, without warning, the light begins to pass through. First, a faint glimmer, then a transparency, then, finally, the lens reveals what has been there all along, hidden by the grain of raw material. Spinoza polished the Gospels for the rest of his life, and he began to see. He saw that John the Baptist, in the primitive narrative, was not a forerunner. He was a master. He was a spiritual leader with his own disciples, with his own theology, with his own movement. He saw that this movement existed before Jesus, during the life of Jesus, and, surprisingly, after the death of Jesus. He saw that in the Acts of the Apostles, chapter 19, Paul still encounters disciples of the Baptist in Ephesus, years after the crucifixion. He saw that the brilliant speaker Apollos, in the previous chapter, also knew only the baptism of John, a phrase left like someone leaving a piece of evidence forgotten on the floor of the crime scene. He saw the imbalance in Flavius Josephus, the Romanized Jewish historian of the 1st century, who dedicates an entire page to the death of John with rich political details and barely mentions Jesus in his work. He saw that Herod Antipas ordered John to be killed, not because of a girl's dance, that is the poetic version of the Gospels, stitched with theatrical taste, but out of pure political fear, because the people, fanatical from the preaching of that man from the desert, could rise in revolt at any moment. And then Spinoza asked the question that no one before him had had the courage to formulate aloud. He asked, what if the first phrase, the brutal phrase, the phrase that says that no one is greater than John, is the true phrase? And if the second phrase, the stitch, the patch, the but the least in the kingdom is greater than he, is the desperate attempt of a later generation to neutralize the poison of that first statement? What if Jesus indeed considered John the greatest, and if this is what has been carefully erased for centuries? The Gospels spend so much time saying that John was small precisely because someone, somewhere, was remembering that Jesus considered him the greatest. and the work of Christian editors throughout the 1st and 2nd centuries was to try to muffle that echo, which did not die, which reappeared at every corner, which survived in entire communities like that of Ephesus, like that of Apollos, like later the Mandeans of southern Iraq, who still today, in the 21st century, keep alive the tradition that the true prophet was John and Jesus, a rebellious disciple. Spinoza had no way of knowing in the 17th century that these communities still existed. He had no way of knowing that centuries later, in 1945, an Egyptian peasant digging fertilizer on a slope near Nag Hammadi would strike with his hoe a jar nearly 2 meters high full of Coptic manuscripts from 1600 years ago, revealing an entire library of Christian texts suppressed by orthodoxy. He had no way of knowing that 2 years later, in 1947, a Bedouin shepherd throwing a stone into a cave searching for a lost goat would hear the sound of clay breaking, and the world would discover the Dead Sea Scrolls, a community of ritual purification on the shores of the Judean desert, with practices so similar to those of the Baptist that archaeologists spent decades asking if he had, at some point, lived among them. Spinoza had none of that. He had only the Gospels, the Acts of the Apostles, Flavius Josephus, and the rare courage to think without asking anyone for permission. And with just that he intuited, with the precision of a geometer drawing the exact curve of an arc, the outline of what 3 centuries of archaeology would later confirm. That there was an erasure, that this erasure was systematic, generational, transversal, done by many hands over many years in many manuscripts, and that the victim of this erasure was a man in camel's hair who fed on locusts in the desert, and who was beheaded by order of a drunken tetrarch in a palace called Machaerus around the year 29 of the Christian era. It was because of this intuition that Spinoza's name became a curse on 3 continents. It was for this reason that kings ordered the burning of his books in public squares. It was for this reason that Catholic priests and Protestant pastors, Orthodox and Reformed, Jesuits and Calvinists, men who massacred each other in religious wars throughout the entire European continent for over 100 years, agreed for the first time in centuries on one thing only, that thin, silent lens cutter, living on bread and beer in a rented room, was the most dangerous creature to appear in Europe since the fall of the Roman Empire. He wasn't. He was just the man who had read carefully. You are about to enter this reading with him. It's not a short path, and it cannot be. When a question has been buried for 2,000 years under layers of catechesis, under mountains of commentary, under the weight of entire generations who learn to look away, you don't unearth it with a quick shovel. You unearth it slowly, with a brush, brushing away the dust layer by layer, at the same patient rhythm with which Spinoza polished his crystals, knowing that only lenses polished with patience reveal what has been right in front of everyone's eyes all along, and that no one saw. In the next hours, you will meet Spinoza at the exact moment he took the Gospels off the shelf and opened them side by side, in Latin, in Greek, in Hebrew, comparing word for word. You will feel the damp cold of 17th century Amsterdam rising through the loose floorboards. You will enter with him into the synagogue on the day of excommunication and hear the words of the herem echoing as the black candles go out one by one. You will spend the night with him at the table, the candle almost burned down, and see how he identifies the stitches, the grafts, the theological patches that separate the primitive tradition from the later redaction. You will discover what the Mandeans of southern Iraq still keep in their sacred books about the man from the desert. You will hear what the Dead Sea Scrolls whisper about an ascetic community that purified itself in running water. You will understand why the rabbinic tradition also, on its side, preferred to silence this figure, and why this silence from the Jews themselves may ultimately be the most unsettling silence of all. And in the end, after all this, walking alongside that small lens cutter through the long night of thinking without permission, you will have to decide for yourself. Because the true question, in the end, was never about who John was, nor about how he died, nor about what he preached. The true question is sharper than any executioner's axe. If Jesus really said he was the greatest, who was so afraid of that phrase that they spent 2,000 years trying to explain it? Close the other tabs. Silence your phone. Settle into your chair as if you were going to spend an entire night reading ancient manuscripts by candlelight, alongside a thin man with deep eyes who refuses to swallow the ready-made version. What comes now is a long, dense story, written slowly, with no hurry to reach the end, because its purpose is not to rush you to the conclusion, but to make you see things that have been right in front of your eyes your whole life, and that you, like everyone else, learn to ignore. When this story ends, after a few hours of demanding patience, I guarantee you one thing only. You will never read that phrase the same way again, and perhaps, just perhaps, you will never read any other phrase the same way again. Never again. The candle had burned almost to the end when Baruch Spinoza realized that his hand was trembling. It wasn't cold. His cold was different. It was the damp fatigue rising through the floorboards of the house he rented in Rijnsburg, a small village west of Leiden, where he had taken refuge after Amsterdam had become too small to contain someone who thought like him. It was April of 1663. He was 30 years old, his lungs already feeling the first signs of the crystal dust that would kill him 14 years later, and he had been sitting at that dark wooden table for almost 4 straight hours. Aside from the occasional noise of a carriage passing in the canal and the distant sound of some dog barking in the cold streets, the house was in total silence. On the table, opened side by side, 3 volumes. One was a New Testament in Greek, Erasmus's edition, bought second-hand from a used bookstore in Leiden. Another was the Latin Vulgate, inherited from his Latin master van den Enden. The third was a complete Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh, a gift from the old Rabbi Manasseh ben Israel, purchased at the time when Spinoza was still considered, in the Amsterdam synagogue, the brightest young man of the generation. Before the expulsion, before the herem, before the knife in the back he received on the night he left the synagogue for the last time, the 3 volumes were open to the same scene, the scene of the baptism, in Mark chapter 1, in Matthew chapter 3. And, on the other side, in the Gospel of John, the strange absence of the scene, the void, the hole where everything should be and where nothing is. Spinoza had a quill in his hands, beside him a leather-bound notebook bought from the former owner of the house. In the earlier pages of this notebook, there were notes in Latin written in small, organized handwriting from someone who thought like a geometer even when reading poetry. In the more recent pages, the handwriting began to change. It became more nervous. It started to scratch. It began to underline. Some sentences had been rewritten 3-4 times in subtle variations, like someone searching for the exact angle at which an idea can be grasped without fleeing. The phrase he had written that night in Latin at the top of a blank page was this: "The stitches of the text are more revealing than the text itself. Zutura tella revelat plusquam tella ipsa." And beneath this phrase he had begun to draw, a diagram, a sort of inverted tree, with the name of Mark at the top, and the other 3 evangelists branching down like descendants. On each branch, he noted the differences, where Matthew added, where Luke changed, where John omitted. And the more the diagram grew, the clearer it became what was happening. Mark, he concluded, was the oldest. It wasn't the church tradition that said this. The church tradition, in fact, always privileged Matthew, placing him first in the canonical Gospels for political and symbolic reasons. But for a reader with clear eyes, without the filter of catechesis, it was obvious. Mark was shorter, rougher, cruder. His sentences had that strong smell of freshly transcribed oral tradition. He made geographical errors. He used Aramaic words that the others later translated. He preserved embarrassing scenes that the others later softened. He simply did not yet know that that text would become scripture, and therefore wrote with that unarmed freedom of someone who is just telling what they heard. And how does Mark open his gospel? Spinoza picked up the Greek volume and brought it closer to the candle. In Mark, chapter 1, verse 1, "The beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God." Good. Verse 2, "As it is written in the prophet Isaiah, Behold, I send my messenger before your face, who will prepare your way." Verse 3, "The voice of one crying in the wilderness, Prepare the way of the Lord, make his paths straight." Verse 4, "John appeared, baptizing in the wilderness, and preaching a baptism of repentance for the remission of sins. John appeared. Spinoza set the candle down on the table and looked at this phrase as one looks at the crater of a meteorite. John appeared. The first human figure that appears in the oldest gospel of Christianity is not Jesus. It is John. The Gospel of Mark opens with John the Baptist in the wilderness, not with the Annunciation, not with the Star of Bethlehem, not with shepherds in the field or with wise men from the east. All those ornaments were added later, in other Gospels. Mark, the original, the raw, the unadorned, opens with a man in camel's hair shouting in the wilderness, and it goes even further. Mark cites the scriptures of Israel, Isaiah, Malachi, to tell the reader what these scriptures are announcing. But what do they announce? Not the Messiah. They announce the messenger who prepares the way. They announce, in other words, John. The first biblical prophecies that Mark invokes to open the Christian era are not prophecies about Jesus. They are prophecies about John the Baptist. In Mark, in the oldest gospel, it is John who fulfills the fulfillment. It is John who is the voice. It is John who is the messenger of the Lord. Spinoza wrote in the notebook in careful handwriting, "In the beginning was John," and then he underlined, and then he underlined again. Because what comes after this in Mark is even more disturbing. The text describes John's ministry. Crowds coming out from all Judea and Jerusalem to be baptized by him, all confessing their sins. Crowds, not dozens, not hundreds, entire crowds coming out of the holy city to the wilderness, and only after that in the background does a man named Jesus appear, coming from Nazareth of Galilee. And what does this man do? He gets in line. He approaches John, and is baptized by John in the waters of the Jordan. Mark does not invent any dialogue here. Mark does not make John refuse. Mark does not make Jesus say, "It is fitting for us to fulfill all righteousness." None of that. In Mark, the scene is simple. Jesus appears, is baptized by John, comes up out of the water, sees the heavens opening and the Spirit descending upon him. Done. The whole scene lasts 3 verses, but it is within this short scene that, according to Spinoza, lies the key. Because in the narrative logic of that time, and Spinoza, as a philologist trained in Hebrew, Aramaic, Greek, and Latin, knew very well how the narrative logic of that time worked. Whoever baptizes is above whoever is baptized. The baptism is a rite of initiation, and the one who administers the rite is the initiator. The initiated is the apprentice. And in Mark, the one who administers the rite is John. Can you imagine how this phrase sounded to the ears of the church in the 2nd century, the 3rd, the 4th? Can you imagine the editorial urgency that this phrase generated? The desperate need to rewrite the scene, to invert it, to at least put in it a dialogue in which John recognized, above all, that he was the apprentice, and not the other way around. Matthew understood the problem. Spinoza moved the candle to illuminate the 2nd volume, opened Matthew chapter 3, and there in the same scene, with the same characters, in the same river, in a moment that should be identical to that of Mark, there was a difference, small but decisive. Matthew had added a dialogue. Verse 14. John, however, was trying to prevent him, saying, "I need to be baptized by you, and do you come to me?" Spinoza drew an imaginary line in the air and murmured in Latin to himself, "Interpolation." Because this phrase is not in Mark, it is not anywhere older. It appears for the first time in Matthew, written a generation later, at a time when the Christian community was already having trouble explaining why their Messiah had been initiated by another man. Matthew, realizing the problem, simply filled the void with a dialogue that serves one single function, to subordinate John to Jesus, with John's own words, in John's own mouth. And so that the reader would have no doubt, Matthew continues. Verse 15. Jesus, however, answered him, "Let it be so now, for it is proper for us in this way to fulfill all righteousness." All righteousness. Spinoza set down the quill. He looked at the flame of the candle, which was now flickering because the wick was almost gone, and realized he was smiling. It wasn't a joyful smile. It was the dry smile of someone who has just seen, in the mirror, exactly what they expected to see. And that expecting to be right, in the case of humanity, is rarely a joy. The phrase, "it is proper to fulfill all righteousness," is one of the most artificial phrases in the entire New Testament. It is a theological phrase grafted into the mouth of a Jesus who, in Mark, simply enters the water and is baptized without saying a word. It is the digital mark of a concerned editor, stitching the old text with new threads to cover a hole that the original tradition left open. And once you see one stitch, you see them all. Spinoza began to take notes. In Matthew, but not in Mark, the Baptist's speech calling the Pharisees a brood of vipers. In Matthew, but not in Mark. John's detailed prediction about the wheat and the chaff. In Matthew, but not in Mark. The moment when John, already in prison, sends disciples to ask Jesus if he is indeed the Messiah, a scene that serves narratively to place Jesus once again on top, with John needing to ask and Jesus having the answer. And it was at that moment, exactly at that moment, with the notebook open, the candle almost burned down, the cold rising through the floorboards, that Spinoza lifted his eyes to the fogged glass of the window and noticed something he had never noticed before. He realized that if Matthew had needed to do all this work of patches, stitches, and grafts, it was because Mark alone left standing a version of the facts that was unacceptable to the church that was being born. And if Mark alone was unacceptable, then Mark alone might be the version closest to the truth. Spinoza slowly closed the volumes one by one. He extinguished the candle with his fingers without blowing. Breaths made smoke, and smoke attracted the rats from the canal. Darkness took over the room. Outside, somewhere between Leiden and Amsterdam, a church bell tolled 3 in the morning. He stood still for a while, in the darkness, and said, in a low voice, in Ladino, the language his mother had taught him before she died. Poor John. Luke, writing probably between the 80s and 90s of the first century, 20 or 30 years after Mark, inherited a problem even greater than Matthew's. His problem was twofold. On one hand, he was writing for a more educated, more Hellenized audience, possibly in Antioch or Rome, an audience of converted Gentiles who needed an elegant narrative with a beginning, middle and end, with formal prologues in the manner of Greek historians. On the other hand, he had raw material that continued to insist on placing John the Baptist center stage. Mark opened with John. Matthew, even trying to balance, opened with John. The oral tradition about the life of Jesus continued to begin in all the early Christian communities with the scene of the baptism in the Jordan. Luke decided to do something radical. He decided to rewrite the beginning. Spinoza moved the candle to the side when, 2 days after that first night, he returned to the table. It was a grey morning, with a fine rain falling outside, of that Dutch rain that moistens more than it soaks. He had slept little. The night before, he had read for the first time in his life the Gospel of Luke with the same philological coldness he had applied to Mark and Matthew. And what he saw impressed him so much that it took him almost a day to return to the table and write about what he had seen. Luke, Spinoza realized, had done something of almost unbelievable narrative audacity. He had invented a childhood, not a childhood of Jesus. That would be less surprising. Every ancient hero had a narrated childhood, and the oral tradition certainly already produced stories of the boy Jesus in circulation. What Luke invented was a parallel childhood, a childhood of John. And in this parallel childhood, he carefully constructed a structure of subordination that would become, from then on, the official way Christianity would read the relationship between the two cousins. Luke begins his gospel not with the baptism, not with the public ministry. He starts much earlier. He begins in the days of King Herod, with a priest named Zechariah, married to a woman named Elizabeth, both righteous and elderly, without children. He begins with Zechariah entering the temple to burn incense. He begins with an angel appearing to Zechariah and announcing that Elizabeth would have a son, and that this son would be named John. Pause here for a moment. This scene, this whole scene, the angel, the temple, the old priest, the barren woman who will become pregnant, is the classic scene of messianic announcement from the Old Testament. It is the scene of Sarah, mother of Isaac. It is the scene of Hannah, mother of Samuel. It is the scene of Manoah, father of Samson. Luke is constructing John as a direct heir of the messianic lineage of Israel, with a supernatural birth, announced by an angel inside the temple at the time of liturgy. But then Luke makes the next scene. He announces to Mary that she too will have a son, and here Luke begins the engineering. The scene of Mary is greater than the scene of Zechariah. The angel speaks more. The content of the prophecy is more grandiose. And when Mary asks how this will be possible, being a virgin, the angel tells her that the Holy Spirit will come upon her and that the Most High will overshadow her. Elizabeth, in comparison, received a more modest announcement. A son of an elderly woman, a miracle, yes, but a miracle of the old school. Mary received something unprecedented. Virgin conception, shadow of the Most High, direct generation from the Spirit. Spinoza wrote in his notebook, hierarchization of the announcements. And he continued, because Luke does not stop there. Luke makes Mary, newly pregnant, travel to Elizabeth's house in the hill country of Judea. And when Mary arrives, the scene that would be painted thousands of times over the next 1700 years occurs, the visitation. Elizabeth feels the baby leap within her. Elizabeth is filled with the Holy Spirit. And Elizabeth cries out with a loud voice, a phrase that no other source of early Christianity records, "Blessed are you among women, and blessed is the fruit of your womb. And why is this granted to me, that the mother of my Lord should come to me?" The mother of my Lord. Spinoza set down the pen on the table and looked out the foggy window. Outside, the rain continued to fall, and the canal was so smooth it looked like a sheet of beaten iron. He thought in silence for a long time. The mother of my Lord, the mother of John, at the moment she is pregnant with John himself, recognizes the mother of Jesus, still in the early months of gestation, as the mother of my Lord. The subordination is sealed not only before birth, but literally within the womb. The baby John, still in Elizabeth's amniotic fluid, leaps for joy, recognizing the presence of baby Jesus, still in Mary's womb. And John's mother, prophesying by the Holy Spirit, declares that the child growing in her cousin's belly is her own Lord. There is no more hierarchizing scene in the entire New Testament. And this scene, Spinoza was almost certain, reading with clear eyes, did not exist. It had not existed. It was a literary invention of Luke, constructed 2, perhaps 3 generations after the events, at a time when the Christian community needed to resolve once and for all the issue of hierarchy between the 2 cousins. And there was a clue in the text itself that confirmed this intuition. The clue was a song. Right after the scene of the visitation, Luke records a song, one of the most beautiful songs in the New Testament, the Magnificat, which begins with the words, "My soul magnifies the Lord, and my spirit rejoices in God my Saviour." This song is traditionally attributed to Mary. It is Mary, according to the canonical text, who sings it in response to Elizabeth's greeting. But Spinoza, reading carefully in Greek, noticed something strange. The song in some ancient manuscript traditions, and Spinoza knew this through the critical editions circulating among Protestant philologists in Holland, is attributed not to Mary, but to Elizabeth. There are manuscripts where the text says, "And Elizabeth said, 'My soul magnifies the Lord.'" And the content of the song, read carefully, makes more sense in Elizabeth's mouth than in Mary's. Elizabeth is the elderly and barren woman who has finally become pregnant, just like Hannah, mother of Samuel, whose song in the first book of Samuel is, word for word, the model for the Magnificat. Mary, in Luke's narrative, is not barren, is not elderly, does not have the narrative profile of the woman whose God reversed her humiliation. The Magnificat, Spinoza intuited, was originally Elizabeth's song, Mother of John. And at some point, in the transmission of the text, someone transferred authorship to Mary. Another erasure, another transfer, another detail that originally belonged to John, and that was gently removed, gently reattributed, gently forgotten. Spinoza sat back in the chair, closed his eyes and remained silent for a long time. Outside, the rain had stopped. A weak ray of sun pierced through the grey clouds and illuminated the canal. Somewhere in the house, the voice of the landlady could be heard talking to a vendor at the back door. And it was looking at that weak light of the Dutch morning, with the Gospels open on the table and the silent echo of 1600 years of automatic readings, that Spinoza realized at that moment that he was alone. Alone in a very specific way. No one in Europe was reading those texts the way he was reading them. Catholics read by the authority of the Church. Protestants by the authority of sola scriptura. Jews simply did not read. For a Jew of that time, the New Testament was an impure book, a Gentile trap, something to be avoided even in visual contact. He was the only person in millions of square kilometers who was sitting at the table with those pages open, without creed, without dogma, without community, without permission. And it was in that exact moment of absolute solitude that he realized the most dangerous thing of all. He realized that this solitude was, in fact, the only condition under which those texts could be read with honesty. I will interrupt this night for a moment because I need to ask you something. With Luke inventing wombs that recognize hierarchies, with Elizabeth singing a song that centuries later would be transferred to another woman, with Spinoza alone at his table on a rainy morning in Rheinsberg, you are not here by chance. You are one of the rare people of this hurried time who can still stand still, in silence, listening to a story that asks for patience. And as Spinoza was alone at the table that morning, I wanted you to do one thing. Write in the comments now before continuing. What do you think happened to Elizabeth's song? Was it really transferred to Mary for some theological necessity? Or was it always Mary's, and Spinoza, reading there by candlelight, saw what was not? I want to know your intuition, not your faith, not your catechesis, your intuition, reading the text with the same silence with which he read. And while you think about that, let me tell you something that few YouTube channels will tell you honestly. This kind of video, which asks for patience, which demands sustained attention for hours, which refuses to cut to a 5-minute summary. This kind of video only survives if people like you decide now to be part of this journey. Subscribe to the channel, not for the algorithm, for the silence. So that these long stories, the kind that Spinoza would have liked to hear before he died, continue to exist in a world that increasingly wants everything shortened, simplified, decaffeinated. Unsubscribe, comment, and come back to Spinoza's table with me, because the morning has barely begun, and what he will discover in the next few hours is more disturbing than anything he has seen so far. Spinoza picked up the pen again, dipped it in the inkwell, and wrote at the top of a new page, the fourth gospel. The fourth gospel, the one that ironically bears the name of John, but which is, in reality, the most hostile to the Baptist, was the last to be written. Most of the philologists that Spinoza had read dated the text between the 90s of the 1st century and the early years of the 2nd, almost a century after the events, almost 2 or 3 generations after the eyewitnesses. And this temporal distance, Spinoza realized, is the key to understanding why this gospel is the most aggressive of all in erasing John. When you are close to the facts, you cannot lie much. There are people alive who remember. There are disciples of the deceased master still circulating the roads. There are primitive documents in circulation, in hastily copied scrolls, in communities scattered throughout the Mediterranean. But when 3 generations pass, when all the eyewitnesses are dead, when oral memory has been replaced by written tradition, and when the community that produced the text is in direct conflict with other competing communities, then, finally, the writer can edit with more freedom. And the author of the fourth gospel edited with a freedom that borders on desperation. Spinoza pulled the Greek volume closer to the candle, opened it to chapter 1 and began to read aloud, translating for himself as he read. The prologue of that gospel is one of the most beautiful pieces of world literature. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Majestic, hypnotic phrases, constructed with the perfection of a crystal shaped by generations of patient hands. Spinoza, even reading with critical eyes, recognized the beauty there. But then, right in the middle of this cosmic prologue, this grand opening that speaks of the eternal Word, the light that enlightens every man who comes into the world, the glory of the only begotten of the Father, right in the middle of this, without any transition, With a suddenness that seems almost a narrative gasp, the text interrupts its own lyrical flight to do what? To speak of John. Verse 6. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. Spinoza set his finger there and stopped. Why, he wondered, why does the author of this almost mystical gospel, who is constructing a cosmogony about the incarnate Word, feel the need, right in the middle of the prologue, before getting to Jesus, before even mentioning the name of Christ, to insert an explicit reference to John the Baptist, and not a complimentary reference, a demystifying reference? Verse 7. This man came for a witness, to bear witness of the light, that all through him might believe. Verse 8. He was not that light, but was sent to bear witness of that light. Spinoza set the pen down on the table. He was not the light. It was not being said to anyone in particular, or rather, it was being said. But to whom? Who in the reading audience of that gospel at the end of the 1st century needed to hear in capital letters, in the middle of a cosmic prologue, that John the Baptist was not the light? The answer was obvious, and it was brutal. It was being said to people who thought he was. You do not write, in your prologue, in your solemn introduction, with all the rhetorical pomp available, a phrase like, "The citizen so-and-so is not the president," unless there is somewhere in your world a popular movement asserting the opposite. You do not waste a phrase on that for pleasure. You do not squander a verse of the prologue to correct a position that no one is defending. The author of the 4th Gospel was correcting. He was polemicizing. He was combating, in the middle of a cosmic prologue, the competing assertion that John the Baptist was indeed the light. And once Spinoza saw this, he saw everything else. Chapter 1, verse 19. This is the testimony of John, when the Jews sent priests and Levites from Jerusalem to ask him, "Who are you?" And John, in the text, does something strange. He answers before even hearing the whole question. He anticipates. He confessed, and did not deny, but confessed, "I am not the Christ." Before the question is even asked, John is already denying. Verse 21. What then? Are you Elijah? And he said, I am not. Are you the prophet? And he answered, No. No, no, no. Chapter 3, verse 28. John, speaking to his disciples, is made to repeat once more, You yourselves bear me witness that I said, I am not the Christ, but that I am sent before him. Chapter 3, verse 30. He must increase, but I must decrease. Spinoza stopped reading, closed his eyes, and counted mentally. In that gospel, in 3 consecutive chapters, the writer made the character John the Baptist deny 7 times, in 7 different formulations, any messianic claim. 7 times. In a narrative of 3 chapters, he was not the Christ, he was not Elijah, he was not the prophet, he was not the light, he only bore witness to the light. He was only the voice, he was only a friend of the bridegroom. He had to decrease. In 7 distinct phrases, the writer of the 4th Gospel tied John in a cord of subordination, so tight that the character can barely breathe. And yet, after all this engineering, the writer still felt the need, repeatedly, to return to the theme, to resume the denial, to reinforce the cord. And the most revealing phrase of all, Spinoza had already highlighted in his notebook 3 times. The omission. Throughout the 4th Gospel, there are descriptions of the Baptist. There are speeches of the Baptist. There are references to his ministry. There are even scenes where the Baptist points to Jesus saying, Behold the Lamb of God. But the central scene, the scene that Mark opens with, the scene in which Jesus descends into the Jordan and is immersed in the waters by the hands of John, this scene simply does not exist in the 4th Gospel. It is not there, it was cut. The author, realizing what Mark had not realized, that scene, read with clear eyes, places John hierarchically above Jesus, simply removed the scene. You read the 4th Gospel from beginning to end and never find Jesus being baptized by John. You find John speaking about Jesus. You find John pointing to Jesus. You find John comparing Jesus to himself. But you never find the gesture. You never find John's hand descending upon Jesus' head. You never find Jesus coming out of the water with wet hair and heaven opening over him. The scene was excised. Like a surgeon removing a tumor, the writer of the 4th Gospel cut with a scalpel the scene that made any honest reader incapable of ignoring the original hierarchy. Spinoza began to write in his notebook with a speed he rarely allowed himself. His fingers were warm despite the cold. The words came out quickly, and he already knew from the first paragraph that what he was writing that morning was, without exaggeration, the most dangerous thing he had thought in his life. Because what was unfolding before him, after 4 days of comparative reading of the 4 Gospels, was a coherent picture. Mark preserves, more or less involuntarily, the outlines of the original hierarchy. John is the master. Jesus is the initiate. Matthew inserts dialogues that try to invert these outlines, making John recognize Jesus as superior. Luke invents a parallel childhood in which the hierarchy is sealed before birth, with Mary, mother of Jesus, being declared lady by John's own mother. And the 4th Gospel, written last, in the most combative phase of the dispute, completes the operation. It makes John repeatedly deny any messianic claim and surgically removes the scene of baptism. 4 stages, 4 different hands, 4 different moments, but the entire operation, viewed from above, was the operation of a careful octopus undoing, tentacle by tentacle, the original importance of a figure who, at some moment in the 1st century, had been too great to be left as it was. Spinoza closed the notebook. He looked at the candle. The candle was at its end. He got up, went to the small chest where he kept the few things he had, and took out a new candle. He lit it from the flame of the old candle. He returned to the table. And he then did something in that moment that would change the rest of his life. He decided to write a book. Not just any book, a book that dared to apply to the entire body of the Scriptures, Jewish and Christian, the same philological coldness he had applied in those days to the particular case of John the Baptist. A book that treated the Bible like any other human text, written by human hands in human times for human purposes, and therefore subject to all the seams, all the grafts, all the edits, all the erasures that any other human text suffers. This book would have a title in Latin, Tractatus Theologico-Politicus, and it would be published in 1670, without an author's name, without a city name, with a false publisher on the cover to try to mislead the censors. It didn't help. Within months, everyone knew who had written it. In a year, it had been banned in all the Catholic kingdoms of Europe. In 2 years, it had been condemned by the Protestant synods of Holland. In 3 years, it was burned in public squares in the great German cities, with the author's name announced in loud voices by the executioner before the bonfire was lit. But that was still many years in the future. On that morning in Rheinsberg, with the new candle burning steadily and the rain having stopped outside, Spinoza did not yet know that he would write this book. He only knew, with a calm certainty that descended his spine, that he had seen something that no one before him had seen, and that he needed to keep looking. At some point between 1663 and 1665, 2 years after that first night of comparative reading of the Gospels, Spinoza moved from Rheinsberg to Voorburg. Voorburg was a village near The Hague, closer to the political and intellectual centers of Holland. There he rented a room in the house of a painter, Daniel Tiedemann, who was also a member of a Protestant sect called Collegiant, a group of Christians without clergy, without fixed dogma, without ecclesiastical hierarchy, who met in private homes to read the Bible in silence and discuss. For Spinoza, it was the perfect environment. The Collegiant had access to books that no one else had. They had critical editions of the Bible, Protestant philological commentaries, translations in Ladino, Flemish, Yiddish. They had, above all, connections with merchants who traveled back and forth from the Levant, Egypt, the Middle East, and who brought from these trips manuscripts and accounts of religious communities that Catholic Europe had never heard of. And it was through these merchants that Spinoza heard, for the first time in his life, about the Acts of the Apostles. He already knew the book, of course. The book was in the canonical New Testament, but he had never read it attentively, because the rabbinic tradition in which he had been raised considered the entire New Testament as a single mass of enemy text, and he, even after the Herem, still maintained reading habits inherited from childhood. He read the Gospels out of philosophical curiosity. The Acts, he always thought, were just a narrative continuation, a minor appendix. he was wrong. On an autumn afternoon in Vorburg, with the golden light entering obliquely through the window of the room and the smell of oil paint rising from the painter's studio downstairs, Spinoza opened the Acts of the Apostles for the first time with critical eyes. He went to chapter 19, and he read. And upon reading he stopped, he reread a third time, and he realized that he had in his hands the clearest, most unequivocal, most undeniable evidence that everything he had intuited about John the Baptist in the previous 2 years was literally true. The scene in chapter 19 of the Acts of the Apostles is simple and, read attentively, devastating. Paul, years after the crucifixion of Jesus, at the height of his missionary activity, arrives in the city of Ephesus. Ephesus was, at that moment, one of the most important cities in the Mediterranean world, capital of the Roman province of Asia, home to the famous Temple of Artemis, a meeting point for philosophers, merchants, and religious cults from all over the empire. It was a cosmopolitan, prosperous, intellectually intense city, and there upon arrival Paul found some disciples. Paul asked these disciples, "Did you receive the Holy Spirit when you believed?" And the disciples answered according to the canonical text, with a phrase that Spinoza highlighted 3 times in his notebook: "We have not even heard whether there is a Holy Spirit." Spinoza looked at this phrase as one looks at a crack in the wall of a fortress. Think about what is being said there. We are probably between the years 50 and 60 of the 1st century. The crucifixion of Jesus happened around the year 30. We are, therefore, between 20 and 30 years after the death of Jesus, in one of the largest cities in the world, and Paul encounters a group of disciples. The text does not say how many, but uses the word that normally designates active followers of a religious tradition who have never heard of the Holy Spirit. Paul, surprised, asks the next question, "Into what then were you baptized?" And the answer is the phrase that Spinoza could not get out of his head from the moment he read it. Into John's baptism. Into John's baptism. 20 or 30 years after the death of the Baptist, in Ephesus, capital of Roman Asia. Disciples baptized in the name of John, still there, still firm, still active, without the Holy Spirit, without Pentecost, without Christianity, just remaining followers of a tradition that had begun on the banks of the Jordan decades earlier, and that, against all expectations, had survived the beheading of the Master, the crucifixion of the Master's cousin, the Pauline diffusion, the preaching of the Apostles, and was still alive and organized in the most cosmopolitan city of the Eastern Mediterranean. Spinoza sat in the chair in Vorburg and remained still for perhaps half an hour. Outside, the golden light was descending. The painter was humming downstairs. A dog was barking in the distance, and he, with that text open on the table, realized with a clarity that pained his chest that he had in his hands the historical proof of what the Gospels tried to erase. The Gospels spent so much time saying that John was small, that John had to decrease, that John recognized Jesus as superior, because that simply was not true. There were, still decades after John's death, entire communities practicing John's baptism without having even heard of the Christian Holy Spirit. There were organized groups, distributed across important cities of the empire, who were followers of an autonomous Johannine tradition, and this tradition did not consider Jesus their master, they considered John. And the text, Spinoza realized, goes even further. In the previous chapter, chapter 18 of the Acts, there is an even more revealing scene. The text describes the arrival in Ephesus of a man named Apollos. Apollos is described with the highest superlatives of the New Testament. A Jew from Alexandria, an eloquent man, mighty in the Scriptures, fervent in spirit. Apollos, according to the text, taught diligently the things concerning the Lord, but then, suddenly, the revealing phrase, a phrase that seems to have escaped the writer's hand and remained there, forgotten on the floor of the crime scene, knowing only the baptism of John. Apollos, this brilliant orator, Jew from Alexandria, one of the greatest intellectual cities of the ancient world, taught diligently the things of the Lord, but knowing only the baptism of John. What does this mean? It means that Apollos, before being instructed by Paul's collaborators, was already fervently preaching a doctrine centered on John the Baptist. It means that this doctrine circulated among the Hellenistic Jews of Alexandria, one of the most sophisticated communities of ancient Judaism. It means that there existed, in parallel to what the Gospels describe as the Christian tradition, a robust, intellectualized Johannine tradition with eloquent preachers, with followers in various cities of the Mediterranean. And these preachers had not yet been absorbed by Pauline Christianity. Apollos needed to be instructed more accurately. The disciples of Ephesus needed to be rebaptized in the name of Jesus. The operation of absorption, conversion, and integration of the remaining followers of John was happening at that very moment, live, in the Acts of the Apostles. And this very book, Acts, preserves the involuntary traces of this operation because, once again like Mark in the case of the Gospels, it was written before the tradition learned to hide. Spinoza began to cross data. If in Ephesus in the year 50-something there were still autonomous Johannine communities, if in Alexandria in the same period there were eloquent preachers following the Johannine tradition, if in Corinth, according to the same Acts, Apollos was already preaching before being corrected. Then John's area of influence, decades after his death, encompassed at least Syria, Asia Minor, Egypt, Achaia. It was a trans-Mediterranean network. It was a Johannine diaspora. And this diaspora, Spinoza intuited, did not die in Ephesus. Paul's collaborators managed perhaps to absorb some groups. They managed to convert Apollos, rebaptize the disciples of Ephesus, integrate part of the network into the emerging Christianity. But a trans-Mediterranean network of this size does not disappear in a single narrative episode. Religious communities have a stubborn persistence. Entire families, for generations, maintain traditions received from their grandparents. Entire villages in remote regions preserve practices that the metropolis has long abandoned. Where did the rest of the Johannine diaspora go, Spinoza wondered. He had no way of knowing in 1665 that the answer to this question was buried in the marshes of southern Mesopotamia, that there, in the marshes of the delta between the Tigris and the Euphrates, in isolated communities that retreated south, fleeing from Roman expansion, Sasanian expansion, Arab expansion, Ottoman expansion, a religious tradition survived that, 2,000 years later, still exists, still purifies itself in running water every morning, still calls itself in its own language the knowers of life, and still venerates John the Baptist as the last true prophet of humanity, the Mandeans. Spinoza had heard something about them. Dutch merchants who went to Persia brought vague reports of a strange sect that lived in the swamps of Ottoman Iraq, who worshipped the stars, who purified themselves in rivers. Portuguese Jesuits in the previous century had sent missionaries to try to convert them and had returned with bewildered reports. These marshes, they wrote, harbor a people that has almost Christian rites, that cites biblical figures, that seems to be a remnant of a very ancient tradition, but that rejects Christ, rejects Muhammad, rejects all established religious authority, and venerates only one prophet with wild hair named Johannan ben Zechariah, John, son of Zechariah, John the Baptist. Spinoza did not have Mandean texts in hand. They had not yet been translated into European languages. They would only be partially in the 19th century. But even from the vague reports of merchants and Jesuits, he intuited that there was, in those distant marshes of the East, a survival, an improbable survival of 2,000 years, a religious time capsule, a living echo of what had been the Johannine diaspora of the 1st century before Pauline and Catholic Christianity swallowed most of its communities. And this survival, he thought, was a witness whose existence alone falsified the official narrative, because if John the Baptist had indeed been just the humble precursor who recognized Jesus as the Messiah, if he had really said he must increase but I must decrease, if he had really pointed to Jesus saying, "Behold the Lamb of God," then his disciples, upon receiving this message from the Master before the beheading, would have immediately migrated to Christianity. They would have abandoned the Johannine tradition and joined the Jesus community. There would be no reason to maintain, for 2,000 years, in remote marshes, an autonomous cult to John. But they maintained it, and they still do today. And this maintenance, Spinoza realized, with the sun already setting outside and the room in Voorburg slowly plunging into darkness, was a living archaeological evidence. An evidence that said, without needing to shout, without needing to argue, without needing any theology, we, the Mandeans, know. We know because we inherited. We inherited from our parents, who inherited from their parents, who inherited from their parents, over 80 generations. And what we inherited is a version of the facts in which John the Baptist is the true prophet, and Jesus of Nazareth, a rebellious disciple who separated and founded his own path. Spinoza closed the Acts of the Apostles. He stood still in the dark room for a time he could not measure, and when he finally got up to light the candle, he realized one very simple thing, but that would forever change the tone of his later writings. He realized that he, Benedict de Spinoza, excommunicated Jew from Amsterdam, lens grinder in Voorburg, solitary reader of Gospels in 3 languages, he was, at that exact moment, closer to the Mandeans of southern Iraq than to any religious community in Europe around him, because he too had been expelled. He too had been considered heretical. He too had survived in isolation, reading the sacred texts with eyes that no one authorized. And he too, although he did not yet know how to translate this certainty into clear words, he too felt that John the Baptist, that man with wild hair beheaded in a desert palace over 1600 years ago, was a figure whose true dimension had been criminally reduced by history. That night, Spinoza wrote nothing more. He just sat there, with the candle lit, looking at the flame. There is a detail in the story of John the Baptist that the Gospels tell with such literary art that few readers realize what is happening beneath the surface. It is the scene of his death, the scene of Herod Antipas's banquet, Salome's dance, the head on the platter. The story, told by Mark in chapter 6 and by Matthew in chapter 14, is vivid, dramatic, almost theatrical. The tetrarch Herod Antipas throws a banquet to celebrate his birthday. He invites the greats of Galilee, military officials, religious leaders. In the middle of the banquet, the daughter of Herodias enters. Later tradition will call her Salome, although the Gospels do not mention her name, and dances. She dances in a way that pleases Herod so much that he drunkenly swears he will give the girl anything she asks for. Even half of his kingdom, he swears. The girl runs to ask her mother. The mother, who harbored an old hatred for John the Baptist for denouncing her illegitimate marriage to Herod, instructs her daughter. The girl returns to the hall and asks for the head of John the Baptist on a platter. Herod is saddened, according to the text. But in order not to go back on his word in front of so many guests, he orders that the execution be carried out. The head is brought. The girl delivers it to her mother. It is one of the most cinematic scenes in the Bible. It has been painted by dozens of masters over the centuries. It has remained in the Western imagination as the prototype of palace intrigue, the fragility of power, female vengeance, the fate of prophets who dare to denounce kings. But it is false. When Spinoza reached this conclusion at some point in 1667, he had already crossed the Gospels with an external source, a non-Christian source, a Jewish source, a source that, alone, carried the weight of a continent. Flavius Josephus. Josephus was a Jewish historian who lived in the second half of the 1st century, exactly the period when the Gospels were being written. He participated in the Jewish revolt against Rome in the year 66, was captured by the Romans, switched sides, and spent the rest of his life in Rome, under imperial protection, writing the history of his people in Greek for a Roman audience. His 2 major works, The Jewish War and Antiquities of the Jews, are the most important historical sources we have about 1st century Judea outside of Christian texts, and Josephus wrote about John the Baptist. Spinoza had a Greek edition of the Antiquities of the Jews, purchased in Leiden years earlier. He found the passage in Book 18, Chapter 5, Paragraph 2. The passage is long, more than an entire page, and describes John with a detail and admiration that violently contrast with the treatment Josephus gives to Jesus, mentioned only in passing in a single short paragraph, which many philologists suspect is a later Christian interpolation. About John, Josephus writes richly. He describes John as a good man, who urged the Jews to practice virtue, mutual justice, and piety toward God, and to unite in baptism. He describes the immense crowd that went to hear him. He describes the political impact of his preaching. And here is the point. Josephus gives a completely different explanation for John's death. According to Josephus, Herod Antipas ordered John's execution not because of a dance, not because of a drunken promise, not because of a wife's domestic hatred. He ordered the killing out of pure political fear. Josephus writes, in words that Spinoza translated into Latin in his notebook, "When others joined the crowd around him, for they were also greatly exalted by his speeches, Herod began to fear that John's great influence over the people might put him in a position to incite a rebellion, for they seemed ready to do anything he advised. Herod then considered it better to kill him before any rebellion could occur than to regret it later when the problem was already established. And thus, due to Herod's suspicion, John was sent in chains to Machaerus, the fortress we mentioned earlier, and there he was killed." Spinoza set down the translation in his notebook and looked at what he had written, "out of pure fear." Not because of a dance, not because of a palace scene worthy of a Baroque opera, out of concrete, real, political fear of John the Baptist's ability to mobilize a popular rebellion against the power of Rome and its puppet tetrarchs. And this, Spinoza realized, is Josephus's version. It is the version that a Roman Jewish historian, writing for a Roman audience, with no Christian agenda, with no need to make John seem small, recorded half a century after the events. For Josephus, John is a figure of great political significance, so great that he frightened a ruler, so great that he motivated his preemptive execution. And Josephus dedicates an entire page to this execution with political analysis, something he does not do for any lesser prophet, and something he certainly does not do for Jesus, whose death receives much more succinct treatment in the same work. The discrepancy between the two versions, Spinoza realized, was revealing. The Gospels transformed John's political death into a domestic palace intrigue. They replaced the fear of a rebellion with the whim of a girl. They replaced the popular threat with a personal vengeance. Why? Because Josephus's reasons, the true reasons, were inconvenient for the nascent Christianity. If John the Baptist had been killed because he was the leader of a popular movement capable of overthrowing the political order of Galilee, then John the Baptist was a leader of a popular movement, not a humble precursor, not a desert hermit pointing to the true Messiah, an autonomous political religious leader with his own agenda, with his own followers, with a capacity for mobilization that frightened kings. And if he was that leader, then his relationship with Jesus was much more complex, much more ambiguous, much more potentially conflicting than the Gospels want to make it seem. Spinoza began to piece things together. He had in hand three converging vectors of evidence. First, the canonical Gospels, which show, at each successive stage of writing, an increasingly intense literary subordination of John's figure. Second, the Acts of the Apostles, which involuntarily record the existence of autonomous Johannine communities in Ephesus, Alexandria, and Corinth, decades after the Baptist's death. Third, now, Flavius Josephus, who describes John as a figure of great political significance whose death was motivated by fear of popular rebellion. The three vectors pointed in the same direction, and that direction was exactly the opposite of the official image. John the Baptist in the 1st century was a giant. The canonical texts of the New Testament, written over nearly a century, represent successive stages of an editorial operation whose purpose was to diminish this giant until he fit, without disturbing, into the narrative space of a humble precursor. But the giant left footprints, footprints too large to be completely erased, footprints that appear in the margins of the Gospels, in the involuntary phrases of Acts, in Josephus's non-Christian narrative, and, Spinoza was convinced, in the remote swamps of southern Mesopotamia, where the Mandeans, 2,000 years later, still immersed themselves every morning in running water, in the name of that prophet whom official history had tried to make small. At some point that night, and Spinoza later, in a letter to Henry Oldenburg, Secretary of the Royal Society of London, would date that night precisely as the day he understood what he had to write. He realized he was faced with a choice. He could abandon the investigation, return to his treatises on the single substance, on divine attributes, on geometric ethics, leave John the Baptist buried where centuries of catechesis had managed to bury him, live in peace, polish his lenses, die in his 40s without disturbing anyone's faith, or he could write. He could put on paper in Latin, with the geometric clarity that was his style, everything he had seen. He could offer the cultured world of Europe a treatise that showed, point by point with philology, with comparative history, with unyielding logic, that sacred texts were not untouchable, that they had been written by men, that they had been edited by men, that they contained seams, grafts, erasures, that they could be read like any other human document. He could do this knowing what would happen. He knew they would burn the books. He knew they would excommunicate him again, now also the Christians, all the Christians together, in rare unanimity. He knew they would try to kill him. He knew they might succeed. He knew that for centuries after his death, his memory would be cursed from pulpits, in synods, in universities. He thought about this for an entire night, and the next morning he sat at the table, dipped the pen in the inkwell, and wrote, on the first page of a new notebook in Latin, in firm handwriting, without any tremor, Tractatus Theologico-Politicus, theological political treatise. Whoever read it later, centuries later, in all the languages of the world, would find there, not only, but certainly, the first pages of critical biblical philology ever written by a modern mind. They would find the first treatise in which the Gospels were treated as historical documents. They would find the first analysis in which John the Baptist was discussed without the automatic filter of dogma. They would find, in embryo, all the tools that centuries later would be developed by German exegetes, by Dead Sea archaeologists, by the discoverers of Nag Hammadi. But this he did not yet know. On that morning in Voorburg, with the pen in hand and the first page blank before his eyes, he only knew one thing, that he was going to write, at any cost. The writing of the treatise lasted 3 years. 3 years in which Spinoza lived more than ever, like a man in slow flight. He moved from Voorburg to The Hague in 1670. He reduced the number of visits. He repeatedly declined the offer of the philosophy chair at Heidelberg University, knowing that accepting it would mean submitting to a form of institutional censorship that would make it impossible to finish the book. He continued polishing lenses to support himself, and he kept writing. In January of 1670, the treatise finally came out. It was printed in Amsterdam by the publisher Jan Ruwerts, one of the collegians who had been his neighbor during his years in Voorburg. It was published in Latin, with no author's name on the cover, with a false editorial designation, Hamburg, at the publisher Heinrich Kühnrath, to try to mislead the censors. The full title was an intentional pun to feign respectability, Tractatus Theologico-Politicus Continens Dissertationes aliquot, quibus ostenditur libertatem philosophandi, non tantum salva pietate, et rei publicae pace posse concedi, sed eandem nisi cum pace, rei publicae ipsaque pietate tolli non posse. In free translation, theological political treatise containing some dissertations in which it is demonstrated that the freedom to philosophize can not only be granted without prejudice to piety and the peace of the Republic, but that it cannot be eliminated without harming both the peace of the Republic and piety itself. The reaction was immediate and catastrophic. Within months, all the intellectuals of Europe knew who had written that book. The first denunciations began to arrive from the Dutch Calvinist synods. In 1671, it was formally banned. In 1672, the civil authorities of the States General requested that it be withdrawn from circulation. In 1674, the book was placed on the index of prohibited books by the Catholic Church. It was burned in public squares in at least 4 German cities. Pastors, priests, and rabbis, for the second time in Spinoza's life, agreed that the author of that text was the most dangerous creature in Europe. Why such fury? What was in that book that frightened so much? There was a lot, but at its center, at the dark heart of the book, was chapter 7. Chapter 7 was, and still is for any honest reader, one of the most revolutionary pieces ever written about how to read sacred texts. In that chapter, Spinoza enunciates what centuries later would be called the historical critical method. He proposes that the Bible should be read like any other book. That to understand it, one must first understand the original language in which it was written. Then one must know the history of each book, who wrote it, when, in what context, for what audience, with what purpose. Then one must compare passages with each other to detect contradictions, seams, grafts. Then one must distinguish what is moral message from what is historical circumstance. And only then, after all this work, can one read honestly. Applying this method, Spinoza dedicated several pages of the Treatise to the figure of John the Baptist. Not with the detail he had developed in his private notebooks. There he held back, knowing that all the material would be too explosive for a single book, but with clear enough indications for any attentive reader to perceive what he was suggesting. He pointed to the discrepancies between the Gospels in their treatment of John. He cited the passage from Acts 19 about the disciples in Ephesus. He cited Flavius Josephus, and he left hanging, without needing to state it explicitly, the suspicion that the canonical figure of the humble precursor was the result of an editorial operation that concealed a different historical reality. It was this, more than anything else, that enraged theologians of all confessions. Because the theologians could read, they knew what Spinoza was suggesting. They knew that if this door were opened, everything would change. If you could question the canonical treatment of John the Baptist, you could question the canonical treatment of any figure. You could question the unity of the Gospels. You could question the inspiration of the text. You could question, ultimately, the authority of the entire Church to define what was revealed truth. The freedom to philosophize, as the subtitle of the book said, was exactly that. The freedom to apply reason to everything, including the texts that for 1600 years had been beyond the reach of reason. It was the freedom to treat John the Baptist as a historical character, with a historical trajectory, with historical followers, with a politically determined death, and not as a piece of a theological puzzle already assembled. In 1673, 2 years after publication, Spinoza received a letter from Heidelberg University. It was a formal invitation to occupy the philosophy chair with a generous salary, paid residence, full academic freedom. Except the text of the letter said that you do not use this freedom to publicly disturb the established religion. Spinoza replied with a letter that became famous. He thanked for the invitation. He said he was honored. But he declined. He explained, with that geometric calm that was his style, that he would not know where the limits of that restricted freedom were, nor how to avoid disturbing an established religion, when his work consisted precisely of examining the foundations of religions. He preferred, he wrote, to continue polishing lenses in The Hague. He preferred the small rented room, the simple bread, the cheap beer, the absolute freedom to think without permission. It was a life without a safety net, but it was the only life in which the work he had begun that night in Rheinsburg, with the candle almost out and the Gospels open side by side, could continue. In 1673, the year he declined Heidelberg, he had already begun writing a second book, even more ambitious, even more dangerous, a book in which he applied to the totality of existence the same geometric method he had applied to biblical interpretation, a book that would simply be called Ethics, Ethica, Ordine Geometrico Demonstrata. And in that book, he would propose a radical reformulation of the concept of God, dissolving the distinction between creator and creature, identifying God with the very infinite nature, and thus opening space for a spirituality that dispensed with all intermediary figures, including, and this he perceived with increasing clarity, the figure of Christ as the unique mediator. Because once you remove Christ's metaphysical privilege, once you dissolve the mediating hierarchy between God and men, once you say that every human being can access the divine directly through rational understanding of nature, then the specific figure of Jesus of Nazareth, important and admirable as Spinoza considered him, ceases to be exclusive, ceases to be the only mediator, ceases to be, in classical theological terms, the Christ, and figures like John the Baptist, Moses, the prophets, the wise, the philosophers, all can return to occupy places of ontological equivalence, places perhaps that originally belonged to them before centuries of theological hierarchization decided who would sit on the throne and who would sit on the stool. The Ethics would only be published in 1677 after Spinoza's death posthumously by his collegiate friends who risked their own freedom to take the manuscripts from his room in The Hague before the authorities arrived. But the ideas of the book were already circulating in private conversations, in letters exchanged with philosophers across Europe, in discreet discussions in the intellectual cafes of Amsterdam. And in one of those private conversations, recorded in a surviving letter, Spinoza made an observation about John the Baptist that is worth noting here. The letter was written to a correspondent whose name time has erased, but the content remained. Spinoza, commenting on his reading of the Gospels, wrote, "This man who preceded Christ was treated by the texts as a precursor, but I suspect that in history he was treated by his contemporaries as a master. There may be, somewhere on the margins, communities that still know this. If these communities exist, and if they ever come to the knowledge of Christian Europe, much will need to be rewritten." 300 years later, in 1945, an Egyptian peasant named Muhammad Ali al-Samman, who was digging fertilizer on a slope near Nag Hammadi, struck a nearly 2-meter-high clay jar with his hoe. Inside the jar, codices in Coptic, dated to the 4th century, containing 52 early Christian texts, most of which had never been seen by modern eyes. Among these texts, lost Gospels, the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Truth. In some of them, the hierarchy between Jesus and other figures appeared in completely different ways than the canonical tradition had established. 2 years later, in 1947, a Bedouin shepherd named Muhammad ed-Dib threw a stone into a cave on the cliffs of Qumran by the Dead Sea, looking for a lost goat. He heard the sound of breaking pottery. He entered the cave and found whole jars of scrolls. It was the beginning of the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, a library of an ascetic Jewish community from the 1st century before Christ to the 1st century after, with practices of ritual purification in running water, with imminent apocalyptic expectation, with customs that disturbingly resembled what the Gospels describe of John the Baptist's preaching. And in the mid-20th century, finally, European anthropologists began to seriously study the Mandeans of southern Iraq. They translated their sacred books, the Ginza Rabbah, the Great Treasure, into 2,000 pages. The Drashadiyaya, the Book of John, into hundreds of pages dedicated exclusively to the figure of the Baptist as the supreme prophet. They discovered with astonishment that there, in that people lost in the swamps, survived a coherent religious tradition that, in all relevant points, contradicted the canonical Christian version of the relationship between John and Jesus. All this happened 300 years after Spinoza's letter. All this confirmed, point by point, piece by piece, with the relentless slowness of archaeology, what he had intuited sitting at his desk in Voorburg, with the candle flickering in the wind and the Acts of the Apostles open in chapter 19. But he was already dead. Benedict de Spinoza died on Sunday afternoon, February 21st, 1677. He was 44 years old. He was in The Hague, in the room he rented in the house of Hendrik van der Spik, a portrait painter. The landlords were at church that afternoon. They were practicing Protestants, and the Sunday after Carnival was a special day of worship. When they returned, they found Spinoza lying on the bed, still dressed, with an open book beside him and a pen on the floor. He had died alone, quietly, without sacraments, without witnesses, from silicosis that had been accumulating in his lungs for years due to the crystal dust from the lenses. There was no religious funeral. The Jews did not claim him because he had been cursed 21 years earlier. The Christians did not claim him because he had never been one of them. The body was buried on February 25th in a Protestant cemetery, in a simple grave, without a name, without an inscription, funded by friends. Later, this grave would be lost. Today, no one knows for sure where Spinoza's bones are, but the manuscripts survived. The night following his death, Before the civil and religious authorities could arrive at the room and confiscate everything, 3 collegiate friends, Lodewijk Meyer, Jarig Jelles and Jan Ruwerts, entered through the back door with the silent permission of the Van der Spik couple and took everything. The books, the notebooks, the letters, and especially the complete manuscript of the Ethics, which Spinoza had finished writing in 1675, but had decided not to publish in his lifetime because he knew with absolute clarity that publication would provoke his death by another means than tuberculosis. In November of 1677, 9 months after his death, the Ethics was posthumously published in Latin in Amsterdam under the title Ethica Ordine Geometrico Demonstrata. It was released without an author's name on the cover, within a collection simply called Opera Posthuma. In the following weeks, it was banned in all Catholic kingdoms, condemned by all Protestant synods, burned in all public squares where it had been distributed. And from then on, for almost a century, Spinoza's name became synonymous with absolute heresy. Pierre Bayle, the great French encyclopedist, wrote in 1697 that Spinoza was a Jew from Amsterdam, a systematic atheist who dared to deny all revealed truths. Philosophers of the stature of Leibniz visited him secretly in The Hague during his lifetime, but refused to publicly admit the influence. Voltaire in the following century would still mention him as an example of what not to say out loud. Only at the end of the 18th century, with Lessing, Goethe, Herder, and especially with the famous pantheism controversy initiated by Friedrich Heinrich Jacobi in 1785, would Spinoza's name begin to be rehabilitated in the intellectual Europe. And even this rehabilitation was partial. It was selective. The German Romantics loved Spinoza for his identification between God and nature, for his sublimation of reason, for his metaphysical monism. But in general, they avoided touching on the pages of the theological political treatise, where he applied the critical method to sacred texts. The Spinoza who was a biblical philologist, the Spinoza who had opened the Gospels side by side in Rheinsberg and had seen the seams, the Spinoza who had dared to suggest that John the Baptist was a figure whose importance had been systematically reduced, that Spinoza remained, for almost 2 centuries, a whispered figure, cited in footnotes mentioned in manuals with caution, discussed openly only in small circles. It took waiting for the 19th century, for the door he had ajar to finally be broken down. The first to break it down were the German critical theologians. David Friedrich Strauss in 1835 published The Life of Jesus Critically Examined, a book that did to the figure of Jesus what Spinoza had begun to do to the figure of John, applied the historical critical method, identified editorial layers, distinguished between the historical Jesus and the Christ of faith. Strauss lost his chair. He was banned, but the door had been broken down forever. Then came Bruno Bauer, Ferdinand Christian Bauer, and the Tübingen School. Adolf von Harnack, Wilhelm Bousset, Hermann Gunkel came. In the 20th century, Rudolf Bultmann with his demythologization, Joachim Jeremias with his reconstruction of the historical Jesus, Ernst Käsemann with his new quest. And among all of them, in study after study, a silent consensus began to form, a consensus that today in New Testament departments of any serious university in the world is simply a professional assumption. The figure of John the Baptist in the Gospels underwent a systematic process of theological reduction throughout the 1st and 2nd centuries. Modern philologists identify this process with technical names. They speak of polemic reduction, Christological subordination, evangelical anti-baptism. In short, they speak of what Spinoza had seen in 3 nights of comparative reading in Rheinsberg, alone, by the light of a candle, with no one to discuss with, no one to guide him, with nothing but the text, intelligence, and the rare courage to think without permission. But there was, throughout the 20th century, an even more spectacular confirmation of what he had intuited. A confirmation that came not from books, not from manuscripts, not from archives. It came from the people. It came from the Mandeans. The first European anthropologists to study the Mandeans in depth arrived in the region at the end of the 19th century. The first to translate their sacred texts into European languages, the Germans Mark Lidzbarski, Theodor Nöldecker, and the Englishwoman Ethel Stephana Drower, wife of a British diplomat in Baghdad, did their work between 1880 and 1950. Drower, above all, lived for decades among them, translated the Ginza Rabbah, translated the Book of John, translated rituals, hymns, exorcisms. And what she revealed to the cultured world of Europe is one of the most surprising things in the history of comparative religion in the 20th century. The Mandeans consider themselves direct descendants of the followers of John the Baptist, who fled Judea after their master's decapitation, after the destruction of the Temple of Jerusalem, after Roman persecutions, after the Christian expansion that tried to absorb them. They migrated, according to their own oral tradition, to the east, crossing the Jordan, crossing Syria, descending the Euphrates to the swamps of the south, where they finally found a geographical hideout so inhospitable that no empire had any interest in occupying it with full force. There, in the marshes, they survived. They survived the Persian Sassanid expansion, the Arab Islamic expansion, the Ottoman expansion. They survived through the centuries as a small but stubborn people, keeping alive a theology, a liturgy, a cosmology, and above all, a historical narrative that radically differs from the Christian and Islamic narratives. For the Mandeans, John the Baptist, whom they call Iohannan or Johanna, or in its sacred form Yahya Johanna, is the last true prophet of humanity. He is the illuminator. He is the one who receives baptism from the angels and teaches humanity to purify itself in the running waters that descend from the celestial worlds. He is the bearer of primordial Gnostic wisdom, inherited from Adam and Seth, transmitted through the centuries by a chain of initiates, and finally made public through his ministry at the Jordan River. And Jesus of Nazareth, in this tradition, appears in a very different light. The Book of John of the Mandeans contains a section in which Yahya meets a man named Yeshu, Jesus, who comes to him at the Jordan and asks to be initiated into the mysteries. Yahya in the text becomes suspicious. He feels that this young Galilean lacks the necessary humility. He senses that he has ambitions that go beyond the role of disciple. He feels, in short, that he is a dangerous candidate for initiation. Even so, Yahya baptizes him, and this scene in itself is fascinating because it structurally corresponds to the scene in the canonical Gospels, but with the hierarchy preserved in its original form. Yahya is the master, Yeshu is the initiate, but according to the Mandean text, after the initiation, Yeshu betrays. He reinterprets the master's teachings. He founds his own religion. He distorts the doctrine of ritual purity. He mixes pagan elements with Johannine elements, and he goes out into the world proclaiming himself as the way, something that Yahya never authorized. The Mandean tradition calls Jesus, in its internal polemical works, Yeshu the liar, or in milder formulations, the prophet of the Romans, indicating that the religion he founded became, over time, the religion of the empire that conquered and persecuted the Mandeans. You need to understand the weight of this documentation. We are talking about a people whose continuous, uninterrupted existence is historically and archaeologically attested since at least the 2nd or 3rd century. We are talking about sacred texts whose oldest layers date from about 3 centuries after Christ. We are talking about a religious community that survived, like a time capsule, maintaining a coherent narrative of its origin that points directly to the ministry of John the Baptist in the 1st century. This community is not a modern invention. It is not a reaction to Spinoza. It is not a polemical creation of the Enlightenment. It existed before Muhammad, before Charlemagne, before Luther, before Spinoza. It existed when the canonical Gospels were still being hand-copied in Coptic scriptoria. It existed when the councils of the early church debated the nature of Christ. It existed in parallel to all this, hidden, persecuted, but alive. And what it carries, in its 2,000-year theological memory, is exactly the thesis that Spinoza had intuited sitting at his desk in Vorburg, that John the Baptist was, in the 1st century, someone greater than the canonical Christian tradition allowed to remember, that there were entire communities scattered throughout the Mediterranean and the Middle East that followed John as the supreme master, that Pauline and Catholic Christianity, over the centuries, managed to absorb, convert, or destroy most of these communities, but that some of them, in swamps, in deserts, on margins, survived. And these survivals, 2,000 years later, are still saying, with a blind and beautiful stubbornness, with a persistence that is in itself a miracle, what the 2nd century scriptoria tried to erase from the pages of the Gospels, that the man with wild hair, who ate locusts and wild honey on the banks of the Jordan, who immersed crowds in the flowing waters of the sacred river, who was decapitated by a drunken tetrarch in a palace called Machaerus around the year 29, that man was, in real history, before any later rewriting, the luminous prophet of Israel. And that what happened to his memory throughout the first centuries of the Christian era was exactly what Spinoza, in a cold room in Vorburg, with the flickering candle and the Gospels open, had summarized in 2 Latin words in his notebook: suture, seam, and graft. But there is one piece missing, the most unsettling piece of all. Because, up to this point in this investigation, the silence about John the Baptist could be explained by a simple theory. The emerging Christianity needed to elevate Christ, and for that, it needed to diminish the competing figure. It is a plausible explanation. It is a consistent explanation. And this was essentially the explanation that Spinoza developed in his private notebooks in Vorburg and carefully insinuated in the theological political treatise. The problem is that it is incomplete, because there is a parallel silence, a silence that comes from the other side, a silence that cannot be explained by the Christian need to elevate Christ because it does not come from Christians. It comes from the Jews themselves. The rabbinic tradition also erased John the Baptist. This fact, rarely noted by lay readers, is one of the most disturbing observations in the entire history of comparative religion. Think about it. The Pharisees of the 1st century, the direct ancestors of rabbinic Judaism, had every reason in the world to preserve the memory of John. John, according to Flavius Josephus, who was himself a Pharisee, was a Jewish preacher from the school of ritual purity, who denounced the moral excesses of the Herodian rulers, who prepared the people for the coming of the Messiah, who had been executed by a Roman collaborating tetrarch. By any normal parameter, he would have been a perfect candidate to enter the pantheon of the late prophets of the Jewish tradition, alongside other martyrs resisting Rome. He would have entered the Mishnah, the Talmud, the Midrashim. He would have become a national saint of post-temple Judaism, and he simply did not enter. As Spinoza noted this clearly. In a letter to a correspondent, probably Henry Oldenburg, although the attribution is contested, he wrote in careful language, "It is curious that the masters of my tradition, who are so concerned with preserving the memory of the prophets and the righteous of Israel, have let the figure of this man of the desert slip through their fingers. The rabbinic texts hardly mention him. When they do mention him, it is with such extreme brevity that it seems like calculated disinterest. Why this gap?" The question is good, and the answer, when one begins to seek it, is more disturbing than one might imagine. Look in the Babylonian Talmud. Look in the Jerusalem Talmud. Look in the oldest Midrashim. Look in the Targum. You will find, in all this immense corpus of rabbinic literature that developed between the 2nd and 6th centuries of the Christian era, perhaps 2 or 3 scattered mentions of a preacher named Johannine in the desert. Nothing substantial, nothing detailed, nothing comparable to the attention that much smaller figures receive in the same texts. And you need to understand the contrast. The rabbinic tradition is an encyclopedic tradition. The rabbis of the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th centuries discussed absolutely everything. They discussed what to eat, what to wear, how to purify oneself, how to pray, how to love, how to fight. They discussed minor figures from the biblical past in hundreds of pages. They invented stories, legends, parallels. They created oral traditions that were later fixed in writing. And about John the Baptist, a figure whose historical existence is attested by Flavius Josephus, a contemporary Pharisee in rich detail, they produced, over 6 centuries, almost nothing. Why? Spinoza had a hypothesis. He did not develop it publicly. He knew it was too dangerous, but he recorded it in his notebooks. The hypothesis was this: the rabbis erased John the Baptist for exactly the same reason that Christians reduced him. He was inconvenient. He was inconvenient for both sides. For Christians, John was inconvenient because he was too great to be merely a forerunner. For rabbinic Jews, John was inconvenient because, as Christianity grew around his figure, any rabbinic claim of John as a legitimate prophet of Israel began to seem like complicity with the Christian tradition. Any rabbi who said John the Baptist was a great prophet would hear from his concerned disciples the following question: "But then Christianity which came from him cannot have any legitimacy." And that question was unacceptable. Faced with this risk, the rabbinic strategy was simple. It was silence. Not to attack John, because attacking him would make him more visible. Not to defend him, because defending him would open the door to Christian claims. Just to ignore him. Let him slip through the folds of the texts. Mention him as little as possible. Treat him fundamentally as if he had not existed with the historical importance he actually had. And this strategy, over centuries, worked. Today, any observant Jew you meet on the street, if you ask about John the Baptist, will tell you that John the Baptist is a Christian figure from the New Testament with no greater relevance to the Jewish tradition. They will tell you this with absolute sincerity, not realizing that this perception is the result of almost 2,000 years of a carefully maintained silence operation. But Spinoza realized, and he realized that the rabbinic silence, combined with the Christian erasure, combined with the Mandean survival, formed a coherent picture. John the Baptist, at some point in the 1st century, had been too great for everyone. For the Romans, he was a dangerous popular agitator, and that is why they killed him. For the early Pauline and Catholic Christians, he was a competing forerunner who needed to be subordinated, and that is why they reduced him in the canonical texts. For the post-temple rabbis, he was a figure politically compromised with the emerging Christianity, and that is why they silenced him in the Talmudic texts. Only one group, small, marginal, persecuted by all, fled to the swamps of Iraq, kept his memory alive in its original fullness, the Mandeans, and only for that reason does this memory exist today. There is a small text that survived, attributed to Spinoza, although the attribution is contested by some scholars, which seems to summarize his perception of this convergence of silences. The text is a marginal gloss, found in a manuscript copy of the theological political treatise that belonged to one of his disciples, and which is now in the Leiden Library. The gloss in Latin says the following: "When three mutually hostile traditions agree to silence a fourth figure, that fourth figure is certainly the key to something that the three traditions prefer to keep closed." The phrase is typical of Spinoza. It is geometric. It is relentless. It has the exact economy of an axiom. And it points to a conclusion that goes beyond the historical question of who John the Baptist was. It points to a broader philosophical question. When all established religious powers agree to silence a figure, when Christians and Jews agree to diminish him, when even the Romans executed him preventively, what did that figure represent? Spinoza, in the final notebooks he wrote in the last months of his life, before silicosis tuberculosis overcame his lungs, exhausted by the dust of the lenses, left a fascinating note. The note is in Latin, dated 1676, and says, "I have reflected on the man of the desert. I suspect that what he preached was something fundamentally incompatible with any religious institution founded on intermediaries. Perhaps that is why all subsequent institutions preferred to reduce him. A religion without intermediaries threatens all intermediaries, whether they are priests, rabbis, or pastors. Without intermediaries." Spinoza wrote that word with force. In the Gospels, John appears preaching the baptism of repentance for the remission of sins. He does not speak of priesthood. He does not speak of temple. He does not speak of hierarchy. He speaks of direct repentance, of direct transformation, of direct immersion in the water that purifies. His preaching, in its most original form, before any later re-editing, was perhaps something deeply subversive. The idea that every human being could, alone in running water, in the desert, without institutional mediation, return to original purity, without needing to buy offerings at the temple. without needing a priest, without needing a priestly class interpreting complicated rules. If this was the essence of John's preaching, and Spinoza, in that note from his notebooks, seemed inclined to think so, then John the Baptist was, in his substance, a natural enemy of all organized religions that would come afterward. The Christians, in building a church with hierarchy, priesthood, sacraments administered by clergy, betrayed the Johannine essence, and therefore needed to reduce their historical founder to fit into the new structure. The rabbis, in building a rabbinic Judaism with classes of masters, with concentrated exegetical authority, with purity rules administered by specialists, also betrayed the Johannine essence, and therefore preferred silence. The Mandeans, surviving in the swamps, without an empire, without formal clergy, without mediating hierarchy, preserved the essence precisely because they became too small to need to betray it. And it was in this convergence, in this late perception, written in the final notebooks, months before his death, that Spinoza, without realizing it, joined the historical problem of John the Baptist with his own philosophy. Because the entire Ethics, this posthumous, geometric, monumental book that he had finished in 1675 and that his friends would publish clandestinely in 1677, proposes exactly that. It proposes a God that is nature itself, without intermediaries. It proposes a salvation that is the direct rational understanding of the first cause, without priests. It proposes a virtue that is the individual effort to exist according to reason, without mediating institutions. It proposes, in short, a spirituality that makes unnecessary all the intermediary infrastructure that organized religions had built over the centuries. And this proposal, the central philosophical proposal of Spinoza, was, at its core, sister to the spiritual proposal that he suspected had been that of the man of the desert. John the Baptist, as Spinoza intuited, had preached a religion without intermediaries. 1600 years before Spinoza proposed a philosophy without intermediaries. The two messages, separated by 16 centuries and by completely different contexts, converged at one point. They converged in the idea that the divine does not need apparatus, it does not need temple, it does not need priestly class, it does not need mediation, and perhaps that is why, perhaps exactly because of that, Spinoza, in his last months, felt for that prophet decapitated in a desert palace 1600 years earlier, a silent, deep, almost fraternal sympathy. The sympathy of the excommunicated for the decapitated, the sympathy of the forbidden philosopher for the forgotten prophet, the sympathy of two solitary minds who in different centuries, in different geographies, had arrived, each in their own way, at the same disturbing intuition, the intuition that the sacred is free, that it does not belong to anyone, and that every institution that tries to possess it, every church, every synagogue, every mosque, every hierarchy, is, in itself, an obstacle between the human being and what the human being seeks. It was with this intuition that Spinoza died on that Sunday afternoon in 1677, with an open book beside him and a pen on the floor, alone in the rented room in The Hague. It was with this intuition that John the Baptist, 1600 years earlier, had walked to the palace of Machaerus, knowing he was going to die. And it was this intuition, transmitted by invisible hands over the centuries, that survived in the swamps of southern Iraq, in the yellowed pages of the Coptic manuscripts of Nag Hammadi, in the Qumran scrolls rolled up in clay jars, in the private notebooks of a Dutch philosopher who died at 44, and that reaches you now 2,000 years later, so that you decide, in silence, with no one watching, without permission from any institution, what to do with it. There is a question that needs to be asked here before we proceed, a question that Spinoza asked silently for years, and that deserves to be put into clear words. If the operation to erase John the Baptist was so systematic, so coordinated, so effective, how did some of this evidence survive within the Christian canon itself? Why was chapter 19 of the Acts of the Apostles not simply excluded? Why was the phrase in Matthew 11:11, with that brutal assertion that no one is greater than John, not suppressed? Why was the Gospel of Mark, the oldest, the rawest, the most embarrassing, preserved alongside Matthew and Luke, instead of being replaced by the more polished versions? The answer is fascinating, and Spinoza understood it well. The answer is that, In reality, there was an attempt to erase Mark. In the early 2nd century, when the Christian canon was still being formed, a theologian named Marcion, coming from the city of Sinope on the Black Sea, proposed a radical version of Christianity. Marcion believed that the God of the Old Testament was different from the God of Jesus, that the entire Jewish tradition was a misunderstanding, that Christianity needed to be purified of all its Hebrew roots. And to support this thesis, Marcion proposed a lean canon, with only one gospel and an edited version of Luke, and 10 letters of Paul. The Church reacted. It reacted by condemning Marcion as a heretic, but it also reacted, and this is what matters, deciding that it needed to produce its own official canon with more texts, not fewer. And it was in this context, at the end of the 2nd century, that the idea of the 4 canonical Gospels crystallized: Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John. Why 4? Why not 3? Why not 5? The official answer is theological. Irenaeus of Lyons in 180 wrote that there were 4 Gospels because there are 4 cardinal points, 4 winds, 4 creatures on the throne of God. But the historical answer is simpler. There were 4 because at the moment when the decision needed to be made, there were 4 texts that circulated with enough authority in important communities that no bishop could eliminate them alone. And among these 4, Mark survived like inconvenient witnesses that cannot be silenced without scandal. It was preserved, but it was marginalized. For over 1,000 years, from late antiquity to the modern era, Mark was considered the least of the 4 Gospels. It was seen as a sort of hasty summary of Matthew with no greater independent value. The Church Fathers wrote extensive commentaries on Matthew, on Luke, on John, and almost nothing on Mark. Mark was buried alive within the canon. It was there, but no one read it attentively. It was necessary to wait until the 19th century for German philologists to begin to realize that Mark was, in fact, the oldest of the 4, that Matthew and Luke had based themselves on him, that he preserved the most primitive tradition. And when this realization became academic consensus, starting in 1860, it also began to be perceived what Spinoza had intuited alone 200 years earlier, that Mark preserved, in raw state, elements of the original tradition that the other 3 had systematically rewritten, including and especially regarding John the Baptist. Spinoza had no way of knowing in 1670 that 2 centuries later, biblical philology would validate his intuition with so many details, but he knew he was on the right path. He felt with that geometric certainty that was his hallmark that he was doing work whose vindication would only come after his death. And he also knew one more thing. He knew that the operation to erase John, although it had been largely successful in the canonical texts, left traces not only in the canonical texts. It also left traces in the non-canonical texts, in the so-called Apocrypha, in the Christian texts that circulated in the early centuries and that were excluded from the final canon. These texts, in the 17th century, were known only in part. Some had survived in Syriac, Coptic, Ethiopian translations. Others were known only by mentions in writings of the Church Fathers, who had cited them to refute them. Spinoza had access to some of these fragments, mainly through the compilations of Protestant scholars in Leiden, who had begun to collect and publish ancient Christian texts in the previous century. And among these fragments, Spinoza identified some that pointed exactly in the direction he suspected. There was a text called Pseudo-Clementines, a series of homilies and recognitions falsely attributed to Clement of Rome, but which were, in fact, late productions of the 2nd or 3rd century, probably coming from Syria. In these texts there are scenes where remaining disciples of John the Baptist enter into direct controversy with followers of Jesus. There are theological discussions in which the Johannine defenders assert the primacy of their master. There is, in a famous passage, a disciple of John named Simon openly declaring that John was the true Christ and that Jesus was an intruder in the prophetic lineage. The Pseudo-Clementines were condemned as heretical. They were suppressed, but they survived in isolated manuscripts, copied and recopied over the centuries by anonymous scribes who apparently had no awareness of how much what they were copying contradicted the official version of history. Spinoza read fragments of these Pseudo-Clementines in a compilation published in Amsterdam in 1650. and what he read confirmed once again his overall design. There were indeed in early Christianity communities that openly defended the primacy of John over Jesus. These communities were defeated, but their existence was recorded against the will of the victors in surviving texts that barely escaped the fire. And there was more. There was the Gospel of Thomas, mentioned by several church fathers as a heretical text in circulation in Egypt and Syria. In the 17th century, Spinoza only knew this text through indirect references, but in 1945, when the Egyptian peasant struck the jar of Nag Hammadi with his hoe, the Gospel of Thomas appeared whole, in Coptic, with 114 sayings attributed to Jesus, and among these sayings, some deal with John the Baptist in ways that the canonical Gospels would never allow. In one of these sayings, Jesus says to his disciples, "From Adam until John the Baptist, among those born of women, there is no one greater than John the Baptist, so that his eyes should not be broken." The phrase is similar to the one that appears in Matthew 11:11 and in Luke 7:28, but it has a revealing difference. It does not have the corrective clause. It does not have the "but the least in the kingdom is greater than he." It stands alone, brutal, unstitched, unpatched, as it may have originally been. Spinoza did not live to see Nag Hammadi, but his intuitions, once again, were confirmed 270 years later by archaeology. In all the years he dedicated to this investigation, Spinoza never stopped polishing lenses during the day. This fact, seemingly trivial, biographical, secondary, has an importance that few commentators understand. Polishing a lens requires a very specific kind of patience. You sit in front of the block of raw crystal and begin to apply emery powder in circular motions for hours. For hours the crystal does not change. For more hours the crystal continues to not change. And you, knowing that it will not change now, continue nonetheless. The great lesson of working with crystals is this: the result does not appear when you want it to. It appears when the work is ready, and the work only becomes ready if you do not give up in the hours when it seems that nothing is happening. Spinoza took this lesson to the reading of sacred texts, and that is exactly why he saw what no one before him had seen, because no one before him had had the patience to polish those texts for years without expecting to immediately see what was inside. And when finally the lens revealed the image, when the Gospels opened side by side showed unambiguously the coherent design of the progressive erasure of John the Baptist over 4 successive redactional stages, Spinoza realized one thing that may have been the most important perception of his entire intellectual life. He realized that the method mattered more than the conclusion. It did not matter so much that he had discovered the specific case of John. What mattered was that he had discovered the method by which any similar case could be uncovered. The method of reading sacred texts as human documents, of comparing versions, of identifying seams, of cross-referencing external sources, of applying geometric logic to philology. This method was the true gift he was leaving for posterity, and it was exactly this method, and not the specific thesis about John the Baptist, that entered the first paragraphs of chapter 7 of the theological political treatise. Take the book today, in any library in the world, and read that chapter. You will find, in clear Latin, the first complete, systematic, geometric formulation of what 3 centuries later would be called historical critical exegesis. You will find the rule that the meaning of the scriptures can only be determined from the history of the scriptures themselves. You will find the demand to know the original language, the historical context, the author, the audience, the purpose. You will find the refusal to accept that any text is inerrant just because it claims to be inerrant, and you will find, embedded in these general rules, without needing a proper name, the key to the case of John the Baptist and to all other cases. This is the reason why the Catholic Church, when placing the treatise on the Index of Prohibited Books in 1674, wrote in the formal justification that the book contained doctrines that undermine the very foundations of revealed faith. The censors understood. They were educated men. They knew Latin. They had read chapter 7. And they had perceived, with absolute clarity, that if that door were opened, nothing would remain as before. It was not just the thesis about John. It was the possibility of the thesis. It was the silent permission that that book gave to any educated European reader to open the Gospels without kneeling, to compare them, to identify contradictions, to ask who wrote, when, for what purpose, to do, in short, with every figure of the New Testament, what Spinoza had done with John the Baptist in the years of Reinsberg and Warburg. And once that permission was in the air, once that book existed, was printed, was discussed, even clandestinely, even dangerously, there was no way to keep it in the bottle. The first to open that bottle after Spinoza were the German Protestant theologians of the 18th century. Johann Salomo Semmler in Halle in 1770, Reimarus in Hamburg, with the Wolfenbüttel fragments published posthumously by Lessing between 1774 and 1778. Eichhorn in Göttingen, with his introduction to the Old Testament of 1780. Each of them reading Spinoza sometimes in secret, sometimes with declared hostility, always with the inevitability of someone responding to an interlocutor whose influence can no longer be avoided, was adding tools to the method. And in 1835, with David Friedrich Strauss and his Life of Jesus, the operation was completed. The figure of Jesus was finally subjected to the same critical treatment that Spinoza had applied to John. The layer of faith was separated from the layer of history. The Christ of preaching was distinguished from the Jesus of Nazareth, and a new era of theology opened, an era in which it was finally possible to ask who those men were, these real men of first-century Judaism under Roman occupation, before centuries of doctrine had transformed them into motionless icons. All of this was inaugurated by a lens polisher who died at 44 in a rented room in The Hague. And the specific case of John the Baptist, although Spinoza was in his time the first to have seen it clearly, has been taken up decade after decade by successive philologists, until it has become today one of the firmest consensuses of New Testament research. Modern specialists summarize this consensus in 3 points. First, John the Baptist was a historical figure of great political and religious importance in first-century Judaism, comparable in weight to other apocalyptic prophets of the period, and perhaps greater than many. Second, Jesus' ministry began within John's movement. Jesus was, in some sense, a disciple of the Baptist before starting his own ministry. Third, after John's death, some of his followers migrated to Jesus' movement, but others remained in autonomous Johannine communities, which survived for centuries in parallel with the emerging Christianity. These 3 points are now recognized by Catholic, Protestant, Jewish, agnostic specialists. There is no serious controversy about them, not in academic departments. What exists is a huge distance between what is known in universities and what is preached in pulpits. And this distance between what is known and what is said publicly, is exactly the distance that Spinoza, with his theological political treatise, tried to begin to close 350 years ago. The distance still exists, but it exists a little less because of that polisher. There is a scene worth lingering over. It is a scene that Spinoza never got to see, but that, had he seen it, he would have immediately recognized as the visible and tangible confirmation of everything he had intuited. The scene takes place in 1932 in southern Iraq. The region is the delta between the Tigris and Euphrates, near the city of Amara, in those immense swamps that geographers call Lower Mesopotamia. An English woman in her middle age, the wife of a British diplomat in Baghdad, is sitting by the edge of a muddy canal. Around her in a line 20 or so people dressed in white descend into the canal. They immerse themselves 3 times in the dark water. They rise, they return to the bank, and they recite in a language that this woman has spent the last 20 years learning to understand, ancient hymns about the celestial lights, about the living waters, about the prophet Yahya. The woman's name is Ethel Stefana Drower. She will spend the rest of her life documenting what she is seeing. And what she is seeing, she understands with increasing clarity, is a rite that has survived, with minimal modifications, since the 1st century of the Christian era. The Mandeans, that people whom Spinoza had intuited from a distance only through vague reports from merchants, were in reality a community still alive, still practicing, still doing in the 20th century, what Mark describes in chapter 1 as what John the Baptist did at the Jordan River. Drower documented everything: the morning purification rituals called masbuta, the priestly manuals, the hymns for the 5 hours of the day, the genealogies of the priests, the cosmogonic myths, the prayers for the dead, and especially the sacred texts, which she patiently translated into English over decades, giving the cultured world of Europe for the first time direct access to that collection. The Ginza Rabbah, the Great Treasure, contains 2,000 pages of Mandean theology, cosmology, ethics, and mythology. The Drasha de Yahya, the Book of John, is almost entirely dedicated to the figure of the Baptist, narrating his birth, his childhood in the desert, his celestial initiation, his ministry of purification, and his death as an ascension to the worlds of light, with no mention of a head on a platter. The Kolasta, the Book of Prayers, contains the liturgical hymns sung in the rituals. And in all these texts, without exception, the relationship between Yahya and Yeshu, between John and Jesus, is presented in a radically opposed manner to the version of the canonical Gospels. Yahya is the master, Yeshu is the disciple. Yahya is the true prophet, Yeshu is the falsifier. Yahya teaches purity, Yeshu introduces deviations. Yahya baptizes with living water, Yeshu invents a different baptism that serves his own ends. The question that Drower and later philologists faced was simple. To what extent does this Mandean tradition preserve authentic memories of the first century, and to what extent is it a late? Polemical elaboration developed over centuries in reaction to Christian expansion. The modern answer is nuanced. Mandean texts, like any orally transmitted tradition fixed in writing late, contain layers from different times. But the basic structure, the absolute centrality of John, the distrust of Jesus, the purification rituals in running water, the theology without a hierarchical clergy in the Christian style, this basic structure is clearly prior to contact with institutional Christianity. Several elements of it, especially the purification rituals and the cosmology of light, show parallels with the Qumran texts discovered in 1947, suggesting a common origin in the apocalyptic Judaism of the first century, before and after Christ. In other words, the Mandeans are not a late response to Christianity. They are, to some extent, a parallel survival from the same religious soil from which both the Johannine and Jesus movements sprang, and they survived by isolating themselves geographically, retreating to the swamps of the south before Pauline Christianity could absorb them. This conclusion is, today, accepted by most experts in comparative religion and ancient Near Eastern studies. And this conclusion, if you stop to think about it, is one of the most disturbing things that can be said, because it means that there exists, in today's world, in the 21st century, in communities that may total 50 to 60,000 people, scattered because of recent wars in Iraq, Iran, the United States, Sweden, Australia, a people that carries in its continuous memory, transmitted from generation to generation, over 80 or so successive generations, a version of the events of the first century that contradicts, in essential points, the version that 2 billion Christians in the world learn as indisputable truth. This people is small today. It may disappear within a few decades under the pressure of wars, migrations, assimilation. When that happens, if it happens, a witness of 2,000 years will fall silent. A time capsule will close. A dissident version of events will become merely a memory of books. Spinoza, if he were alive today, would probably make a short and bitter observation about this. He would say in Latin, with his usual economy, something like, "Inconvenient witnesses die in silence." But the silence of inconvenient witnesses is, in itself, a testimony. And he would be right. Because what the Mandeans say with their simple persistence, without needing to argue, without needing to prove, just existing, is something that no theology manual could completely silence. They say, "We were there. We remember." That is not how history happened. And that phrase, even today, is more dangerous than any philological argument from any professor in Heidelberg or Tübingen, because it comes from living flesh. It comes from memory transmitted by hands. It comes from the act of immersing every morning in running water in the name of a prophet that official history decided to reduce. When Spinoza finished writing the theological political treatise in 1669, he set aside biblical philology for a time and turned to the work he considered the most important of his entire life, the Ethics. The Ethics does not explicitly speak of John the Baptist. It does not explicitly speak of Jesus. It does not explicitly speak of Moses, the prophets, the apostles, or any historical figure from the religious world. It speaks of God, of substance, of attributes, of passions, of freedom. It is a geometric treatise in the literal sense of the word, written like a book of Euclid, with definitions, axioms, propositions, demonstrations, corollaries, scholia. But there is, in the midst of this geometric treatise, a part that silently converses with everything Spinoza had thought about John the Baptist in the previous years. It is the fifth part, the final part, the part called On the Power of the Intellect or on Human Freedom. In this part, Spinoza presents his doctrine of salvation, and this doctrine is radical in a way that few readers perceive. For Spinoza, salvation does not come through mediation. It does not come through sacrament. It does not come through adherence to a religious institution. It does not come through belief in a specific historical figure. Salvation comes through understanding, through the intuitive knowledge of God, through the rational comprehension that all reality is a single infinite substance and that each finite being is a mode of that substance, expressing it in a particular and necessary way. Whoever understands this, Spinoza writes, achieves beatitude, not as a future reward, but as a present state. Beatitude is the understanding itself. It is the joy that accompanies adequate knowledge. It is the liberation from the sad passions that come from ignorance about the real structure of the world. And this beatitude, this is the fundamental point, does not require any intermediary. It does not require a priest. It does not require a prophet. It does not require Christ, Buddha, Krishna, Muhammad. It requires only the individual's own effort toward understanding. It requires the patience to polish the lens of one's own reason until it becomes transparent enough to let the light of reality pass through as it is. You can see, I hope, why this doctrine silently converses with the earlier investigation into John the Baptist. John the Baptist, in the intuition that Spinoza had developed during his years in Warburg, was a preacher of a direct spirituality, without institutional mediations, without priesthood, without temple. His central message, stripped of later rewritings, was the possibility for each human being to purify themselves directly in the waters of the river, without needing to buy doves in the Temple of Jerusalem, without needing the established priestly circuit. The Ethics proposes, in rational philosophical language 3 centuries later, a parallel structure. Each human being can save themselves directly through understanding, without needing to buy mediations in the market of organized religions, without needing the established clerical circuit. The two messages, despite being different in vocabulary and context, have the same enemy. The enemy is the mediating institution. It is the professional class that lives by offering access to a sacred that it itself defines. They are the Pharisees of John's time, who had turned the law into a tangle of rules administered by specialists. They are the priests of Spinoza's time, who had turned faith into a tangle of sacraments administered by specialists. They are, in any era, the intermediaries who live off controlling access to the divine. And that is why John the Baptist was killed, and that is why Spinoza was excommunicated, and that is why any historical figure who dares to propose direct access to the sacred without institutional mediations finds, sooner or later, an axe, a bonfire, or an anathema. The difference between Spinoza and John the Baptist in this respect is merely tactical. Both proposed, at heart, the same thing. John proposed a religion without priests and was decapitated for it. Spinoza proposed a philosophy without mediators and was excommunicated for it. Both survived in small, isolated, marginal communities that kept their memory alive away from the control of official institutions. The Mandeans kept the memory of John in the swamps of southern Iraq. The small Spinozan circles kept the memory of Spinoza in Amsterdam, The Hague, then Berlin and Jena, and finally with Goethe in the pantheon of world literature. But the structural similarity is striking. Both were figures that threatened the monopoly. Both were treated as enemies by all the established religious institutions of their time. Both survived persecution in minority and dispersed formats, and both today are recognized with increasing admiration by those who managed to free themselves from the institutional filter to look at what they really said. Some say, and this is a fascinating although unprovable speculation, that Spinoza, in his last months of life, felt a deep personal identification with the figure of John the Baptist. There are letters of his, some authentic, others of dubious attribution, in which he compares himself, in a melancholic tone, to a man who preached in the desert and whose voice not everyone wanted to hear. The image of the desert in particular appears repeatedly in his later writings, and it is not hard to understand why. The desert is the place of those who are outside, of those who have been expelled, of those who do not belong. Spinoza had been expelled from his synagogue. John had lived outside the temples. Both were men of the desert, in different but converging senses. And perhaps, in the long summer afternoons he spent sitting at the table in The Hague, with his lungs already burning from silicate dust, with the sun coming through the window of the room and illuminating the manuscripts of the Ethics in the final stages of revision, perhaps in those moments Spinoza felt in silence a silent brotherhood with that wild-haired prophet who had lived 1600 years before him, and whose voice he had helped to recover, even knowing that this recovery would only be effective long after his own death. They are the children of the desert. They are the men who chose the margin. And they are, in the end, the ones who see further, because from the margin, one sees the whole. There is still one question, a question that may be the most important of all, and that, if this journey does not address it, will have missed the point. The question is this: why does this matter today, to you? You are not Spinoza. You are not a theologian. You are probably not a specialist in New Testament studies. You may be Christian or you may not be. You may have been raised in a religious tradition or you may not have been. You may just be curious about history or philosophy, or about this strange figure of the Baptist that appears in the stained glass windows of churches, and you are reaching the end of this long journey, and you may leave it with just one more piece of information, interesting perhaps, but inert. Something you remember in the next conversation and then forget. But perhaps if you are attentive, you can leave it with something different. You may leave with a new question, not about John the Baptist, about yourself, because the fundamental point of Spinoza's work, and the fundamental point 1600 years earlier of the preaching of the man in the desert, is not a historical piece of information. It is a method. It is a posture. It is a way of being in the world that applies to any text, any institution, any figure, any claim to authority. The method is simple to describe, and almost impossible to practice. It consists of reading, listening, observing, without kneeling beforehand. In receiving any message, even if it comes from a very high place, even if it comes wrapped in 1600 years of tradition, even if it comes surrounded by billions of other adherents, and in asking calmly, without aggression, but without automatic reverence, who is saying this? Why are they saying it? What does this person or this institution gain if I believe this? This question, applied to the Gospels of the first century, made Spinoza see what had been done to John the Baptist. The same question, applied today, in the 21st century, to the world around you, makes anyone see equivalent things everywhere. In the news you read, in political speeches, in religious messages, in academic authorities, in medical authorities, in business authorities, in family authorities, anywhere someone asserts something with the expectation that you will believe it simply because they asserted it. Spinoza's question is the vaccine against all forms of automatic credulity. It is not cynicism, it is not permanent distrust, it is lucidity. It is the habit of polishing one's own lens until the light of reality passes through it without distortions. It is the patient, silent, endless work of a lapidary, who knows that the finest lenses only reveal what is there after hours and hours of grinding dust. And the result of this work is not the destruction of faith. It is not the destruction of respect. It is not the destruction of admiration. Spinoza never destroyed any of that. He continued to admire Christ until the end of his life. He continued to respect Moses. He continued to venerate the wisdom contained in the Hebrew Scriptures. What he destroyed was something else. It was automatic credulity. It was unexamined acceptance. It was obedience without understanding. And in destroying that, he did not take anything of value from faith, on the contrary. He restored to faith its dignity, because a faith that survives examination is stronger than a faith that needs examination to be prohibited. A reverence that survives the question is deeper than a reverence that needs the question never to be asked. And it is precisely at this point that the case of John the Baptist becomes paradigmatic. Because what happened in the first Christian centuries with the memory of John, the reduction, the erasure, the seams, the graphs, did not happen due to the bad character of anyone. It happened for the same reason that similar things happen in any human institution at any time. It happened because the institution in formation needed a coherent narrative. It needed a hierarchy. It needed a single central figure, and a competing figure, even if historical, even if real, even if admirable, was inconvenient for the narrative. So the competing figure was softened. It was repositioned. It was reduced. This was not done by evil men. It was done by men who believed they were doing good. It was done by sincere bishops, by devoted copyists, by passionate preachers defending the faith they had received, each of them in each generation making only small adjustments, a phrase here, an omission there, an emphasis on the other side, without knowing that the sum of these small adjustments over generations would produce a radical alteration in the image of a historical figure. And that is the most important lesson of this entire investigation. The great historical changes are rarely made by evil hands. They are made by well-intentioned hands, over generations, each doing a small thing without perceiving the whole. And to rescue the truth afterward, after generations have passed, after sources have accumulated, after edits have settled, requires the rare patience of a lapidary. It requires the slow and unshowy work of comparing versions, identifying seams, asking who gained what at each stage of the process. This work is not only historical, it is existential. Each of us in daily life is surrounded by versions of reality that have been stitched together by successive hands, usually well-intentioned over time. Versions of the history of our country, versions of the history of our family, versions of who we ourselves are, inherited from parents, teachers, institutions, algorithms, and the work of polishing the lens of one's own reason, of identifying seams, of asking who gains what if we believe what has been handed to us. This work is the work of a lifetime. Spinoza did this work with the Gospels, and from this specific work he left a universal method. The method belongs to anyone who wants to use it, and you now know that it exists. Benedict de Spinoza was buried on a damp Sunday in February of 1677 in a Protestant cemetery in The Hague. The coffin was carried by 6 men. Behind the coffin walked perhaps 20 people, some acquaintances, some neighbors, the Van der Spijk couple, who had been his landlords for the last 6 years. No one from his biological family attended. All the relatives who still lived in Amsterdam had renounced him decades ago on the day of the Herem. There was no speech. There was no religious ceremony. The coffin was lowered. The earth was placed on top. The attendees returned home in silence, and in the following weeks, while the manuscripts of the Ethics and other posthumous treatises were clandestinely printed by Jan Ruwerts in Amsterdam, someone, it is not known exactly who, perhaps Ruwerts himself, perhaps Lodewijk Meyer, wrote in Latin on a loose sheet that survived in the Leiden archives a phrase that could serve as an epitaph for the man who had just been buried. The phrase is this: Corte. Just that. A single Latin word, Corte, carefully. It was a word that Spinoza used a lot. It was his personal maxim. It was what he had engraved on a ring he wore on his finger. The word meant for him the general posture toward life, the posture of someone who needs to think in hostile environments, who needs to write under censorship, who needs to express themselves without being caught by the authorities. Corte, carefully, with patience, with method, without fanfare, without haste, without spectacle. And this is, perhaps, the last lesson that this journey can offer you. Because the truth about John the Baptist, the truth about any figure whose image has been altered by centuries of institutional redaction, the truth about yourself and about what you inherited from others without examining, this truth is not conquered with shouts. It is not conquered with heated discussions on social media. It is not conquered with public proclamations that alienate interlocutors. It is conquered carefully, polishing the lens, comparing sources, identifying seams, without accepting anything by authority, but also without rejecting anything by reflex. Corte. This was the method by which Spinoza, alone in a cold room in Rheinsberg, with a candle almost burned out and the Gospels open side by side, managed to see what 1600 years of devoted readers had not been able to see. This was the method by which he outlined, with the precision of a geometer, the contours of a historical erasure that 3 centuries later archaeology would confirm. This was the method by which he built, in the Ethics, a philosophy that is still today one of the most radical contributions to human thought about God, nature, and freedom. And this was, in the end, the method by which he remained faithful throughout his life to a figure distant from 1600 years ago, decapitated in a desert palace, whose memory he had decided not to allow to fade completely. John the Baptist, before Spinoza, was in Christian countries a humble precursor, a friend of the bridegroom, a voice in the desert. After Spinoza, he continued to be these things for most people. The institutions did not change overnight. The catecheses continued teaching what they had always taught. The stained glass windows continued painting the scene of the platter with the head. The painters continued depicting Salome smiling. But something changed underground. It changed that from the theological political treatise onward, any educated person in Europe knew that it was possible to read those texts with critical eyes. It changed that, from the 19th century onward, entire university departments began to apply Spinoza's method to the Old Testament, the New Testament, rabbinic texts, Islamic texts, texts from any religious tradition. It changed that, from the discoveries of Nag Hammadi and the Dead Sea in the 20th century, the cultured public began to have direct access to ancient sources that confirmed, in detail, intuitions that Spinoza had had alone. It changed that, from the translations of the Ginza Rabbah and the Book of John made by Drower and her successors, the world discovered that there still exists today, alive, a 2,000-year-old community that maintains a memory different from that recorded by the canonical Christian tradition. All of this happened because of that lapidary, not only because of him, but in part, and in significant part. And today, 2,000 years after the decapitation of John the Baptist, 350 years after the death of Spinoza, you are here, at the end of this long story. In some city in the world, on some night or some morning, with the screen lit, hearing the final words of a narrative that asked of you a patience that your time rarely grants. You made this journey. You went to the end. You followed Spinoza from that first night in Rheinsberg, crossed with him the 4 Gospels open side by side, read chapter 19 of the Acts with new eyes, heard Flavius Josephus's version of the political death of the Baptist, got to know the Mandeans of the swamps, saw how rabbinic silence added to Christian erasure, understood how the theological political treatise inaugurated 3 centuries of critical exegesis, realized how the Ethics proposed a philosophy without intermediaries parallel to the preaching, without mediators of the man of the desert, and now arrived at this last paragraph. And what you do with all this is your problem. There is no demand here. There is no obligatory conclusion. There is no creed to be recited. Spinoza wrote nothing in life that could be recited. He founded no school that could demand adherence. He created no method that could be certified. He just lived carefully, thought carefully, wrote carefully, polishing lenses during the day to sustain himself and the sacred texts at night, to liberate them. Perhaps all that this story wanted to offer you in the end is an invitation to be more careful with what you inherit, more careful with what you accept, more careful with who you decide to be, more careful with the ready-made images that others hand you, whether those images are about historical figures, about your own history, about the world, about God, about what you are capable or not capable of doing with your life. More careful, in short, with the only thing that is truly worth being careful about. That is the truth. Not the absolute truth, with a capital letter and an army behind it, but the small, patient, unshowy truth that is discovered slowly over the years, polishing the lens, comparing sources, identifying seams, asking, always asking, without aggression, without kneeling, just asking. The truth that John the Baptist, in his own way, tried to preach on the banks of the Jordan. The truth that Baruch Spinoza, in his own way, tried to write in the rented rooms of Rheinsberg, Furberg, and The Hague. The truth that the Mandeans, in their stubborn and small way, still immerse themselves in every morning in the swamps of southern Iraq to find. And the truth that you, now, at this very moment, as you close this narrative, carry with you for the rest of your life. Corte. Carefully. That is how he lived. And that is how he wrote. And that is how, without ever knowing it, he returned the voice to a man decapitated 1600 years before. A man who perhaps, from some place outside of time where there is no longer a difference between who was and who is, smiled silently, on the damp night of February of 1677, when the coffin of a small Dutch lapidary was lowered into the cold earth of a cemetery in The Hague.